Good morning, everyone. The Honorable Marvin Gonzalez, Minister of Public Utilities, Mrs. Dawn Callender, Chairman of the Regulated Industries Commission, Board of Commissioners of the Regulated Industries Commission, Mr. Glenn Kahn, Executive Director at the RIC, Mr. Jean-Michel Paul, Generation Expansion Engineer at the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, Dr. Curtis Boodoo, Assistant Professor, Utilities Engineering, the University of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Courtenay Mark, Retired Chief Technical Officer at TNTech, distinguished speakers and presenters, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning again. Welcome to the RIC's inaugural webinar, which intends to provide a platform for constructive dialogue and exchange of information on topics on the theme, Why Are Our Days Getting Hotter? Climate Change, COP26, and You. I am Drisa Ramjon, the Corporate Communications Manager at the Regulated Industries Commission, and I will be your host for the first part of this morning's proceedings. We are also streaming live on the RIC's Facebook page. So if you know anyone who'd like to join in the discussion this morning, they can head over to the Regulated Industries Commission on Facebook. So to begin this morning's proceedings, I would now like to invite Mr. Glenn Kahn, Executive Director of the RIC, to deliver welcome remarks. Mr. Kahn?
Good morning, and thank you, Drizzle. The Honorable Marvin Gonzalez, Minister of Public Utilities, Mrs. Dawn Callender, Chairman of the Regulated Industries Commission, other members of the Commission, our esteemed speakers, presenters from here locally and abroad, my colleagues at the RIC, members of the media, all participants, a hearty welcome to all of you. Well, Drizzle gave you the theme of our webinar this morning. It's actually the first webinar that's been held by the RIC. And when you consider the topic, and you think about what the RIC does, the RIC is the regulator for electricity and the water and wastewater sectors. You can make some connection between the two, because on the one hand, what you have happening is that generation uses a lot of fossil fuel, and that is one of the ingredients that makes the world hotter. It's not the only one, but it's one that has a significant impact on that aspect. And when you think about that and you think about what it does to the environment, then that also impacts on the availability of water. So that we are not out of place talking about these issues, because it really falls within our background. And we have with us three eminent presenters who will be giving both the global, the regional, and the local perspectives. And then we have our RSC personnel who will be telling you what the RSC has been doing in these areas over the past few years. So I welcome you to this, our first webinar, and I hope that you are active participants, that you not only listen to what is presented, but that you make your input and you have your questions, and they will be responded to at the panel session. So thank you very much for being with us, and I look forward to the day's proceedings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kahn. I would now like to welcome Mrs. Dawn Callender, Chairman of the Regulated Industries Commission, to deliver some opening remarks on behalf of the Commission. Mrs. Callender.
The Honorable Marvin Gonzalez, Minister of Public Utilities, Board of Commissioners of the Regulated Industries, Mr. Glenn Kahn, Executive Director, Regulated Industries Commission, Mr. Jean-Michel Paul, Lead Engineer for Generation Expansion, the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, Dr. Curtis Boodoo, Assistant Professor, Utilities Engineering, University of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Courtenay Mark, Retired Chief Technical Officer, TNTech, distinguished speakers and presenters, management and staff of the Regulated Industries Commission, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. I am happy that you are able to join us at our webinar this morning. At the recently concluded United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, world leaders, international organizations, and policy groups, after days of debating and negotiating, left with several key objectives, reaffirming the pledges made at COP21 towards fighting the climate crisis. At COP26, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change expressed alarm and utmost concern that human activities have already impacted global warming by an estimated 1.1 degrees, and thus impacts are already being felt in every region. It was clear that immediate and drastic action was required. Despite that realization, the G20 world leaders, generally accepted to be the largest carbon emitters, did not respond enthusiastically to the need to reduce global temperatures. Rather, they demonstrated various degrees of reticence as they continued to favor their national politics and national development over the needs of human civilization and our survival. After much compromise, the Glasgow Climate Pact gained the commitment to more or less hold the pledges made at COP21 in Paris 5 or 6 years ago. However, the global average temperature in 2020 had already approached the lower limit of the temperature increase that the COP21 agreement sought to avert. The effects of increased climate temperatures are already being experienced around the world. The year 2020 was recorded as one of the warmest in our lifetime, the other two being 2016 and 2019. The last decade was the hottest decade ever recorded, and the past 5 years have been the hottest 5 on record for the second year running. July 2021, 4 months ago, earned the unenviable distinction as the world's hottest month ever recorded. At home in Trinidad and Tobago, we have now become used to battling with temperatures exceeding 34 degrees centigrade. Climate change continues to be the greatest risk facing the world. While a 1% increase may sound small and rather insignificant, it is not. This small number carries huge impact. Do, however, note that we are not even on track to achieve this number, and the United Nations has already expressed the fear that we are heading for a temperature rise of 3 to 5 degrees this century. But we at home in Trinidad and Tobago cannot claim ignorance. Thanks to the wonderful technology, which brings reports from all over the world into our home and hands, and which, by the way, contributes to our increased consumption of electricity and global warming, we are now witnessing the effects of climate change in our own region. In June 2021, Ghana's President, His Excellency Dr. Ali, called attention to the widespread devastation created by extensive flooding and lamented the loss of livelihood and the destructions of homes and farms. In 2019, after 36 hours of pounding by Hurricane Dorian, the Prime Minister of the Bahamas, the Most Honorable Dr. Hubert Minnis, lamented, "The Bahamas is presently at war and being attacked by Hurricane Dorian." We should also, excuse me, we should also recall images from Hurricane Maria in September 2017, which devastated the northeastern Caribbean and prompted discussions on whether the existing hurricane scale that ends at 5 is still applicable, or whether we need a new scale to describe some events as Category 6 hurricanes. Right here at home, we are suffering the erosion of our coastlines and the bleaching of our coral reefs. At Glasgow, the most significant resolutions to commit to tougher climate pledges included grand statements, but implementation is proceeding too slowly. These statements include reducing carbon dioxide emissions by shifting away from fossil fuels and phasing out subsidies, protecting nature and biodiversity by halting and reversing forest loss and land degradation, and cutting methane emissions, the second most important greenhouse gas after carbon dioxide, and which is related to an overall improvement in the standard of living and a preference for a meat diet. All these topics will be explored more fully by our esteemed speakers this morning. They will begin the discussion on important and realizable changes to renewable energy generation, renewable electricity generation, the benefit of switching to electric vehicles, and green hydrogen as a source of energy. However, we in Trinidad and Tobago do not have the luxury of being too theoretical or idealistic. Rather, it is important for us to strike the right balance, since our economy and the very standard of living we currently enjoy are dependent on petrochemicals and fossil fuel resources. While we accept that we must transition to net zero, our transition must be reasonable, managed, and importantly, acknowledge the need to diversify our economy. So let us speak about you in our webinar titled COP26, Climate Change and You. Household behavior is acknowledged as a crucial but overlooked opportunity for climate action. We can all contribute to solving the crisis, to protect and restore ecosystems, to avoid loss of homes, livelihood, and even lives. This is our collective problem, and there is still time to avoid the most egregious outcomes. Too often, we wait for a savior when we can take the first steps towards solving problems ourselves. Efficient electricity consumption is a goal we can all work towards, starting today. So here are 4 simple, practical areas which could be your personal contribution. Turn off the lights when you leave a room and unplug appliances and chargers when not in use, thereby reducing the amount of electricity consumed. A power strip could help you turn off multiple items with one click. Run air-conditioned units at comfortable rather than glacial temperatures. No one should have to wear a sweater in an office or even worse at home in our tropical climate. Make use of solar energy by air drying clothes on a clothesline versus using an electric dryer, especially during the long, hot, dry season. Adjust your diets and consumption habits so we generate less waste. And while we're at it, consider how we can consume to reduce the need for foreign exchange and support our local producers. I urge that we stop talking about what may be possible and do what is possible now. And I close by reminding us of the words of Carl Jung. Nature must not win the game, but she cannot lose. It's now my pleasure to invite the Minister of Public Utilities, the Honorable Marvin Gonsalves, to add his voice to this important conversation.
Mrs. Dawn Callender, Chairman of the Regulated Industries Commission, RIC, Board of Commissioners of the RIC, Mr. Glenn Kahn, Executive Director of the RIC, Mr. Gary Jackson, Executive Director of the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, Dr. Curtis Boodoo, Assistant Professor, Utilities Engineering of the University of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Courtenay Mark, Retired Chief Technical Officer of TNTech, distinguished speakers and presenters, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. It has become the new normal for us to meet this way in a virtual setting, given the continued effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. This unprecedented phenomenon has impacted how we come together to share ideas and how we collaborate on issues affecting us as a country, a region, and a global village, as is the case for climate change and renewable energy. But a new normal involves so much more than online interactions. It is also characterized by extreme weather events, warmer oceans, rising sea levels, and higher than average temperatures. It has become critical that these conditions be addressed at all levels to safeguard the future of our country and our world. Taking innovative and immediate steps to combat climate change must be high on the agenda for governments around the globe, especially in light of the findings of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th Assessment Report. This report makes it clear that this era is one of the worst warming periods in history and constitutes the loudest wake-up call to date for meaningful and actionable reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. As the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, put it, we are on the edge of an abyss and we are moving into the wrong direction. But we in Trinidad and Tobago hope to be moving very much in the right direction with regard to energy efficiency and renewable energy initiatives. The Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. the Honorable Keith Rowley, led a delegation to the recently concluded 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties in Glasgow, Scotland. At the conference, world leaders, climate experts, campaigners, and financiers discussed the pressing issue of the intensifying climate crisis. This year's conference aimed to reach a consensus on actions to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, and to secure net zero emissions by 2050. At the conference, the Honorable Prime Minister clearly articulated the government's commitment to take immediate action locally with the establishment of several key projects to promote energy efficiency and the transition over reasonable and manageable time to net zero emissions, notwithstanding the inherent challenges in accessing financing for such projects. As Dr. Rowley indicated in his COP26 address, we in Trinidad and Tobago are already experiencing the effects of climate change. Loss and damage are already obvious in the aggressive erosion of our coastline and the bleaching of our coral reefs. Increasingly inhospitable conditions for agriculture and intensifying storms are additional risks that threaten the survival of small islands like ourselves. Tackling these issues must remain a priority of any global climate action framework. The three main drivers that prompted the start of the transition to renewable energy and the adoption of energy efficiency measures worldwide were the increase of global fuel prices, the increase of energy demand against the backdrop of finite resources, and the ongoing threats from climate change. Cognizant of the need for action, the government of Trinidad and Tobago is currently taking steps to develop a national energy policy green paper that recognizes renewable energy combined with energy efficiency and utilization of compressed natural gas in the transportation sector as important strategies for the promotion of sustainable development of the nation. The government is also in the process of developing a sustainable energy program which aims to manage its natural resources more sustainably, enhancing the use of renewable energy and energy efficiency. Currently, the Tea and Tech Act and the Regulated Industries Commission Act make no specific provision for renewable energy power generation by independent power producers. The government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago is seeking to establish a legislative framework for the generation of electricity from renewable energy sources. This involves the review and the amendment of acts that govern the Regulated Industries Commission, the Trinidad and Tobago Electricity Commission, and the Electrical Inspectorate of the Ministry of Public Utilities. To inform this review, the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries is in the process of finalizing its policy to govern feed-in tariffs. The RIC has also played a significant role as a member on this committee. Some of the measures being undertaken by the government to reduce emissions and build climate resilience include the following: the establishment of the largest utility-scale solar renewable energy project in the Caribbean, with a capacity of 112 megawatts, accounting for 10% of the country's power needs. The plan is to increase renewable energy generation to 30% of the country's total power needs by 2030. The development of an e-mobility policy. Measures are also being implemented to phase in electric vehicles in Trinidad and Tobago. The development of a just transition of the workforce policy aimed at reskilling, retooling, and developing new capacity for a low-carbon economy. The pursuit of measures to facilitate investment in green hydrogen to provide green feedstock for the petrochemical industry, and the exploration of the use of industry-generated CO2 in possible carbon sequestration projects. It is my hope that these will be the first of many similar initiatives achieved through collaboration, both locally and regionally, and the acquisition of funding from external and global entities. With that template, we can continue to move in the right direction and place ourselves on the right side of history with regards to climate change. I thank you for the courtesy of your attention, and I wish you a successful conference.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. It is at this juncture that my duties as host comes to an end, and I will now hand you over to my esteemed colleague, Mr. Cornell Motley, Standards Engineer at the RIC, who will be your moderator for the remainder of this morning's session. Thank you, and I hope you have an informative and enjoyable time with us today. Cornell?
Thank you, Giselle. All protocols observed. I wish to welcome our online viewers on Zoom and Facebook to what promises to be a very informative and engaging event. And we hope that the following presentations will stimulate you to consider how your individual use of energy and electricity can be modified to help slow down the current rate of climate change. There's been a very strong call for action by many of the world and regional leaders in COP26, from which it is hoped that the enabling environments will be created to facilitate each and every one of us to positively impact and ultimately reverse the damage being done to the planet. Viewers, we look forward to your participation, and your questions are welcome. For the viewers on Zoom, please send in your questions using the question and answer feature at any time throughout the webinar. And for the viewers on Facebook, you can use the chat facility. We shall seek to answer as many of your questions during the panel discussion and the question and answer segment of the program. And any questions not answered at that time will be subsequently answered via the RIC's online platforms. I will now introduce our first guest speaker, Mr. Jean-Michel Pal, who will be taking the place of Dr. Gary Jackson, who unfortunately is unable to participate as advertised. Mr. Pal also works for the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, commonly referred to as CECRE, which is based in Barbados, and he's a generation expansion engineer in CECRE's Generation Expansion Unit. That unit works alongside the renewable energy and energy efficiency units to accomplish CECRE's strategic objectives. Mr. Pal is presently leading CECRE's flagship Integrated Resource and Resilience Planning Program, the IRRP program, which supports the development of traditional integrated resource plans for electricity generation for CARICOM member states, while further factoring climate risk analyses in the planning process. He's currently managing the development of IRPs for 4 CARICOM member states, inclusive of Trinidad and Tobago. In addition to this primary responsibility, he leads the development and validation of energy system models and analyses. He helps facilitate regional capacity building in integrated power sector planning and works in close coordination with supporting agencies, consultants, ministries, utilities, and regulators in the various CARICOM member states. He's a trained mechanical engineer with 10 years experience in electricity sector planning and project development. His topic is on energy security for the Caribbean region, present and future activities and initiatives, and climate change. I now invite Mr. Pal to begin his presentation.
So first off, thank you for having us. Thanks on behalf of the CCRE, myself. And second, and importantly, I'd like to convey apologies from Dr. Jackson. He expressed that he really wanted to be here today to deliver this presentation, but unfortunately some circumstances came up which prevented that from happening. So I'm here in his stead, and I hope I can do the presentation on the topic justice today. So as already mentioned, the topic today is energy security for the Caribbean, present and future activities and issues to address climate change. Now sitting down with this topic, I realized it was a big topic that we could take in very many directions and talk for a lot more than 20 minutes. So I've sort of carved out a little bit of a niche that I'd like to present to you today. And in particular, given the background that Cornella has already presented about me, I'm going to take a programmatic approach. I'm going to present to you from the foundation of where I stand, which is planning, and in particular, integrated resource and resilience planning. And I'll try and address this topic today. So I'll go through this very quickly because Cornell had a very comprehensive and kind of introduction about me and the center. So we are an institution of CARICOM, for those that don't know. We are one of the newer agencies operationalized in May 2018. We're a regional implementation hub for the systems, and we support low carbon energy futures regionally and nationally in working with countries throughout the region, member states of CARICOM. So today, this is how I propose to go through this topic. The context was given and amazing background was given to lead into these presentations. I don't think there's too much I have to actually say about that anymore. But we're trying to approach a resilient energy future in the face of climate change. What are the needs? The needs, we need to mitigate climate change. We also need to adapt to it, particularly in the Caribbean. My approach, or what I'm coming to talk to you about today in particular, is holistic and responsive planning, which I think is the way we can approach this. So again, the programmatic approach to ensuring that we get to a resilient energy future. Now, I don't necessarily like the step-by-step approach. I rather craft it into a narrative. So I'm approaching it in a slightly different format, and I do hope it works for you. So the narrative I want to approach it with is, how can holistic and responsive planning like IRPs help us mitigate the risk from and manage and adapt to the impacts of climate change? So I'm starting with the program. For those of you who don't know, our IRP program is one of our flagships. I have a little bit here about the partners. It's not just a CCRE. It's actually a group of partnerships that allow this to happen. Support from the German Development Corporation, GIZ, and its CLARES program, CIMH. I'll talk about that a little bit as I go through the presentation, and strong partnership with the CARICOM Secretariat, and as well member states. I just want to make this clear for those that don't know. We are essentially supporting the development of these plans along with member states. It isn't just us doing this by ourselves. This is achieved through strong partnership, which is another thing I'm going to touch on as I go through the presentation. So just to highlight some of the places we're working in, Cornell already mentioned Trinidad. There's also Guyana, Belize, and we recently started in St. Kitts and Nevis. I should say Trinidad and Tobago, forgive me. So the foundation, for those of you who are unfamiliar with integrated resource and resilience planning, the foundation is the integrated resource plan. It's a legacy approach. It's not very new, decades old, maybe a little older than me even. And what an IRP does is it outlines a plan for resourcing electric utility or region's needs and allows them to meet the expected electricity demand over a long-term planning horizon. I'd like to highlight some of these terms. We can, go through it in detail, but the highlights help. Resource needs, the IRP was, when it came about, it approached it in a slightly more modern way, which is that it no longer considered just the building of large power plants to satisfy demands. It also looked at other ways that demands could be satisfied, which include things on the demand side, like energy efficiency. Long-term planning horizon, typically we look at 20, 25 years. This depends. You can look at IRPs throughout North America. Internationally, you'll see slightly different times. So that's not necessarily an issue. That's down to stakeholders and the planning function. And I highlighted optimization in this nice diagram here, which it comes from one of the providers of one of the softwares we use in this process. And it actually shows how optimization happens. And what traditionally used to optimize for is least cost. And I'll tell you how that's changing a little bit as well. So the evolution now is integrated resource and resilience planning, which is how this started. What changes? Right now we introduce actually vulnerability analysis. I'm not saying it wasn't introduced before, but it's in the forefront now. As you can tell by the name, it's a core part of the process. It's no longer just an add-on or something that may have been considered depending on who's delivering this project for you. It is core to it. And in that, we look at climate data, climate change scenarios, hazards. We're going to go into that a bit more in the presentation. What it does also is it shifts that perspective, as I told you, the IRP had of least cost to more least regrets. So ideally, with the inclusion of a much wider base of considerations, you now have something that should be a more resilient and responsive plan. Right? And in here, in the insert, you just see a press release, very topical given today's theme from CIMH, one of our partners, press release, record-breaking heat in 2020, a new norm. And you can tell from the introductory comments that it definitely is a new norm. So shifting gears. So why is this IRRP an effective mechanism to drive mitigation and adaptation of the power sector? I jumped ahead here a little. We talked about the response to climate change, but I also mentioned in my introductory slides how these responses have been outlined typically under the themes of mitigation and adaptation. So we're going to explore how the IRP can respond to that. So just to take a step back to mitigation and adaptation, we don't want to make any assumptions or leave anybody behind if you're not fully aware of what each one would consider. I like this diagram a lot. It's from City in Canada, their climate resilience strategy. And it shows you a Venn diagram here. So obviously there's clearer mitigation efforts, which are actions to reduce emissions that cause climate change. You had some of that in the intro. There's a clear adaptation efforts that allow you to adapt to what's happening, the risks that we are going to face and are going to deepen under climate change. And there's some that are in the middle, you'd see here. And some of these are not necessarily applicable because I guess I'm coming here grounded. I'm talking about the power sector. So you'll see stuff dealing with agriculture, water conservation mentioned in the intro, but I'm more focused on energy. The adaptation side is quite applicable to most any sector. Absolutely, all three of those will be applicable to our system. So back to the IRP process, because this is going to be my launchpad to show you how mitigation and adaptation efforts can be achieved and successes can be achieved through the process. Usually I spend a bit more time on this if I'm doing a presentation completely on the IRP. I won't spend too much time today. I wanted to show you that there's two parallel tracks essentially. One, which is the traditional IRP or expansion plan on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, that additional R. This is the step. These are the steps we go through to examine hazards and vulnerabilities, establish risks, and see how we'll treat with those. So I found something interesting actually going through this. So I included this in the presentation, and I realized how neatly it maps onto the mitigation and adaptation Venn diagram I just presented, which is quite nice because realistically, a lot of the efforts you see here listed under mitigation really come out of this path on the left-hand side, and the adaptation comes out of the risk analysis side. So let's go through mitigation a bit. So to bring it in context, I know I'm coming from a regional center, so I hope I don't disappoint you too much by not focusing on the wider scope, but I like to bring it to my audience. So just to start by saying, and I'll jump around the slides a bit. Going back here, you see one of the first things we do is set objectives, right? Critical, these objectives should align across the board. Ideally, we want to have stakeholders working together and efforts not be disparate, but be conjoined and work to the benefit of everything we're doing in country, essentially. So I raised this one, and you don't need to focus on the whole thing. There's a lot of words here, really, but you just look at the piece that says sectors and the title and the focus in Trinidad, and it's intended nationally to make contributions. There's a focus on power generation, transport, and industry, right? I guess big ticket items for seeing how you can manage and potentially reduce over the long term greenhouse gas emissions. These things must factor into the power sector development plan, right? So this is the first step in how mitigation begins to be outlined. And in Trinidad, I believe, unless I'm remembering wrong, there's a umbrella target covering those three industries that's meant to be achieved by 2030. Objectives factor in first. We go down the line and we start to look at scenario building, which is one of my favorite parts of the IRP process, working through the building of scenarios with stakeholders. There's so many different ways this could go. If you're interested, I can't spend too much time on it, but I'd encourage you to look at how different processes, places, and programs approach scenario development. Scenarios can be used for in a bunch of different ways and for a bunch of different reasons or objectives. However, essentially, it's crafting a story about the future, a narrative, essentially. And you can use it as a target. You can use it to explore, craft a narrative about what the future could be like and see what the impacts of that could be. So there are various ways you could use scenarios, which I won't go into all today. This one is just a nice diagram from, this one actually comes from Ireland. And I'll take a quick aside here to say, you know, we're in the process of finishing the first few phases of the IRPs. I would have loved to show you some of the proceeds coming out of that and some of the stuff we're actually working on, but unfortunately, we're not at the stage yet where I have the ability to show you those. So I've pulled out some other good examples from around the world. So this one is Ireland, and it sort of shows you that one of their scenarios in the tomorrow energy scenarios, this project done by this air grid group. And it shows, there were 3 of them, I believe, under this. And this one shows how, you know, coherent plan-led initiative leads to a low carbon future for Ireland. So scenario building is a key part of the IRP process where you can explore different scenarios for the future. And then what you can measure these against the objectives that you set in the future. And I mentioned one thing in the objectives is the NDCs, but obviously Trinidad and Tobago and any other member state in the Caribbean has a number of other goals and objectives they want to meet developmentally in so many other different areas. And what you do, you translate those into KPIs and you evaluate those different potential scenarios of the future. But scenarios might sound a little gray or uncertain to you, and that's fair. Sometimes the narrative can just be, it's a story, but you need to get quantifiable, particularly in something like this, where the goal is to give you an actionable plan, right? So what we use various tools that take us from the scenario level down. So I just pulled out some pictures from one of our brochures for one of the softwares we use. And it just goes to show you the different elements that can be brought in. So in Plexus, which is the software, we conduct the scenario analysis. It sort of takes that story and it takes that idea of what it is you want in a given future, and it gives, it looks at options and it determines the best. So it's starting to optimize, and you can optimize for various things. I mentioned already some of that before. The answers, or what it will essentially tell you, where we start getting into harder numbers, in the bottom right. It will tell you which technologies to build or retire, how much capacity, what and where to build. So these insights coming out of that process can now inform your decisions. Again, so these decisions are for the power sector, but I mean, they begin to cross over into others. And I put here refined commitments as well. So the important thing is that sometimes maybe you want to start with an umbrella goal like Trinidad has, or maybe you don't have, and some of the member states don't quite have firm targets. And perhaps that's because certain analyses were not done to determine maybe how much reductions you could get out of the power sector. I think these kind of different plans and initiatives will hand in hand. So you do power sector planning. And something like this, you can actually start to realize, what is a scenario for the future that we think is possible in Trinidad or probable even. What does a development plan under this scenario look like I just told you a while ago. Then from there, you can look at what those impacts are and how it's measured, the KPIs for that. If it meets all the KPIs you've set or the targets you've set, let's say it meets the economics, you don't want the cost of power to go up, nobody does. It actually brings down emissions. You start to have quantifiable numbers that you can bring into something like an NDC now. So you can say this is a path we would like to pursue. It would redound in this quantum of emissions reductions, and we're going to carry it into the NDC. They play off each other. So the NDC can inform. You can also refine those commitments once you get the insights delivered from plans such as IRP. Really, they got to work together. So that was mitigation and how I see plans like these can really deliver on mitigation. Adaptation now, we're going down the other path. Just starting off by saying, and this is also a reason I said a bit clear of giving you the full background on climate change and so on. I'm not an expert. I work with very good people and experts in this field, both in terms of hazards, in terms of climate change. So I just wanted to have a slide to recognize that resilience is a team effort. We work with the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology and the Climate Studies Group at MONA as well. In-country stakeholders who identify hazards, assess vulnerabilities, help us with that, help us understand what has actually happened in a place like Trinidad and Tobago or other member states, because what's happened on the ground is critical. And just some other points on this, on how we approach this. We build risk and resilience considerations in early. That's why I showed you parallel tracks. You start going and exploring these things very early so you can see where it can affect the power sector plan. I already mentioned it's going to redound to climate resilient investment opportunities, and you're strengthening in-country capacities. I really like this diagram, and it just kind of shows you how it all works together. On this side, basically we're facing hazards, we're facing shocks, like floods, hurricanes, we're facing stresses, like what's changing under climate change in our environment. And then vulnerabilities. Now, this is a broader consideration. You see everything here, physical, social, economic, and vulnerability is a broad topic. But specifically here, you have certain infrastructure vulnerabilities that will be exposed by certain hazards. And of course, the exposure circle is just to say that the assets, the people, something has to be exposed to the hazards for the vulnerability to be exploited. And these all result in risks at the center here. So you kind of set me going with the hazard considerations here with the topic of today. So I'll touch on hazards and just dive into a little bit of vulnerability. So this is just a slide which shows you the gamut of potential hazards one might face. And of course, you see on the top right there, risk due to extreme temperatures. Cold spells not applicable for us. This is a general diagram. Heat waves. You'd see all the others. We are no strangers to in the Caribbean. Again, shocks and stresses. I like this one as well. Just throwing out another hazard applicable to today's conversation. This actually comes from the State of the Caribbean Climate Report. A good read if you haven't, if you're unfamiliar with it. The original source is IPCC. So we talk a little bit about, I like trying to translate these things into, even me, sometimes, again, I'm not a climate scientist. I like trying to translate it into what the real impacts will be on the ground. So I like this diagram because a lot of times we talk about the increase in mean temperature, and this just shows kind of what it means, the increase in mean and variance, the temperature means for extremes. And you can shoot all the way to the right, and the right of the right-hand inset, and just see it means much more hot weather and more record hot weather if there's an increase in mean and variance. Vulnerabilities now. So I actually just took this. This is standard. I chose this particularly for the audience here today, but it's just from a regular GE gas turbine performance characteristics data sheet. And it essentially shows what the effects of ambient temperature and increasing ambient temperature are on various variables to do with operating gas turbine. So you can see here, a number of different things. You see the output dropping, green line, you see the heat rate going up, the heat rate going up is not a good thing. It's not ideally the heat rate should be lower, which is essentially indicating a greater efficiency. So what this is saying, you're losing output and your efficiency of production is going down. I mean, we could talk a lot about this stuff. I mean, I have 20 minutes and I'm noting my time, I'm approaching it. So I'm zooming through these, but I encourage you to, you can look up some of this information and we can speak about it later as well. So this one, I want you to focus on the center of this. This is a cut sheet, a data sheet from a solar module. And you can see here, I'm not sure if everybody knows, but solar PV modules are, the output varies depending on the environmental conditions, and in particular the temperature. So you can see here the temperature coefficient of Pmax, which would show you the maximum power output at any given time. There's a negative correlation here. You see negative 0.36% per Celsius increase, and that would probably be above the test conditions that the panel was put under. So the bigger one, I mean, we focus on climate change today, but I have to say, because it's a huge part of it, I mean, we focus, again, I like to use the terms kind of loosely, but shocks and stresses. So the shocks, and these are the big ones we all know about. Here I just pulled something from a post-disaster needs assessment from Hurricane Maria in Dominica. There's a little error in the recovery needs. I think that's actually EC, the first number, but ignore that. The whole point is you can look at the part I brought out, which indicates the level of damage that the system experienced. And by indicating this, I'm not necessarily suggesting that we can avoid or prevent every bit of damage or cause the whole system to survive, but I'm just here to show you vulnerabilities of the systems, what the potential impacts can be, and highlight the need to address them. And ultimately, the way I started, you can tell I'm encouraging you to address them through the IRP. So I'm at about time. I think I'm a minute over. I'm going to close off with 2 slides for you. Some takeaways I hope you can take from this. The resilient path forward must be informed by inclusive processes. Inclusive, I mean, we have a collaboration here in a regional institution and Trinidad and Tobago. There's that. There is the institutions in Trinidad and Tobago and other member states working together. There are experts who don't normally cross the boundaries between the sectors working together. This has been enlightening for me, even this process from the center side and working closely with climate and experts on hazards and so on. And I encourage it. It really, it'll redound to the benefit of any member state that pursues inclusive processes. And it's mandatory for something like this because you can't do it alone. The power sector can't do something like this by itself. Standard data-driven, evidence-based, consistent and analytical approaches to support critical decision-making. That's how we're going to address climate change. That's how we're going to approach climate change. That's how we're going to help mitigate it. And essentially, that's what the entire global collaboration around the fight against climate change, recognition of it and the fight against climate change has been underpinned by this. Considerations of risk and our changing climate critical. And number 4 is really, number 1, just reiterating, make strong linkages between disparate efforts to attain our ultimate outcomes. Channeling Dr. Jackson's voice, he always talks about collaboration and encourages us to work collaboratively to achieve our goals. And this one I also mean specifically looking at, because this is the topic of the day, integrating that work, toward for the climate and mitigation and adaptation efforts, integrating it with all the other plans like this one, which is focused on the power sector. And my last slide. I think the IRP is a tool that's fit for purpose and achieves all the aforementioned goals, right? And can be one of the tools in the toolkit to help us mitigate and adapt. CARICOM and CICRI, we both strongly endorse institutionalizing this iterative process as a method of choice going forward for this sector. And that's how I think we'll ensure sustainable and resilient development while addressing climate change. So a niche presentation today, but I hope I went somewhere in addressing today's topic, and thank you again for inviting us. And a quick thank you to the partners that make this possible. Thanks again.
Thank you, Jean-Michel, for presenting the regional context with respect to climate considerations to today's discussions. And I look forward to a lively discourse during the panel discussion. At this time, I'll just like to remind our viewers that we are fielding questions via our question and answer feature on Zoom and also the chat feature of Facebook. Our first comment actually came in from Mr. Randy Neal via the Zoom feature. So Mr. Neal, if it is that you have further questions, can you post it via the question and answer? And Mr. Neal's contribution was that he pointed out that the Courtenay mangrove wetlands are being impacted by construction and that the country should be sensitive to the impact that that is causing. Our second guest speaker is Dr. Curtis Boodoo, who currently holds the position of Assistant Professor in the Utilities Engineering Unit at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, UTT. He has been a faculty member at UTT since 2004 and Program Coordinator for the Electrical and Electronics Engineering Diploma Program at the John Donaldson campus since 2008. He developed and currently administers the first dedicated renewable energy engineering technician level program in CARICOM. He was the project manager for the electric bus project in Trinidad and Tobago and is currently the chairman for the electric vehicle work group in CARICOM, a position he has held since 2017. He's consulting for the United Nations Development Program's Renewable Energy Project in Trinidad and Tobago and oversees the design and construction of 12 community solar photovoltaic installations. He has also worked on projects for the United Nations Environment Program, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, the Inter-American Development Bank, the German-based development service provider GIZ, the Government of Barbados, and the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. His topic is on climate change opportunities for Trinidad and Tobago. I now invite Dr. Boodoo to join us remotely to begin his presentation.
Thank you, Cornell. I hope you could hear me clearly and see my screen.
I am hearing you clearly and seeing your screen.
Thank you. I'm delighted and excited to be here this morning, and a special thanks to the RIC for inviting me and allowing me this opportunity to present. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the front lines of climate change. We in Trinidad and Tobago are a small island developing state like most of our CARICOM neighbors, and we are most adversely affected by the effects of climate change. You would have heard from the chairman of the RIC when she did mention that we currently do see the effects of coastal erosion. The minister as well mentioned that. And climate change is upon us. It is an existential threat. Now, if you look at this graphic, you might think that 2050 doesn't look all that bad. Yes, we are losing some coastlines. And at the location of the River Swamp, we would be below sea level. But however, before we went into COP26, we were in line for a temperature rise of not 1.5, but 2.7. And after COP26, with the recent commitments, we could see a rise of 2.4. So this graphic is more representative of what Trinidad could expect at the end of the century. You could see that we would have, most of Port of Spain would be below sea level. Now this extends all the way to Quebec. So that is Sawa, Barataria, and the entire Courtenay swamp, of course, would be under sea level. And then we would have lost the River Swamp and Lower Manzalina. Of course, we would have lost some of the peninsula in the southwest of the country. So when I say this is an existential threat, ladies and gentlemen, it is. It will most definitely affect perhaps not the lives of the persons attending this conference today, but most definitely the lives of our children and grandchildren. And it is our responsibility to ensure that we do not reach the stage whereby our way of life is significantly affected. As I mentioned, we are a small island developing state, but Trinidad is very much unique. We are a net exporter of energy. We have a considerable hydrocarbon industry. We are well known for our oil and gas expertise. So committing to net zero, it's a fine line for us. We want our economy to continue to be healthy. In fact, we want it to grow. But yet we are SID and we are vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Now, perhaps my argument is that we should move forward and declare a date for which we would be net zero. And I would recommend 2050. I would recommend 2050 because from the list here, you would see all our brother and sister SIDs, they have declared 2050 as net zero for them. And among our CARICOM neighbors and sisters, we have Jamaica, Barbados, and Grenada who have declared 2050 to be their net zero targets. But how do you maintain our industry, our economy, and have economic growth and commit to net zero as well? Well, the purpose of my talk this morning is to present a pathway for us whereby we can commit to net zero by 2050 and also keep our industries and even expand our industries. So on this graphic, you would see this photo. This is the Honorable Foreign Minister for a SID in the South Pacific. That SID is Tuvalu, and this Honorable Minister is Minister Simon Kofi. And this is how he chose to deliver his COP26 presentation, to highlight the effect of climate change on SIDS. And perhaps we can learn some aspects of their approach in the CARICOM region from our sister SIDS in the Pacific. So I want to start off with the energy sector, and the Honorable Minister did mention Project Lara. And in my view and the view of others, Project Lara is one of the best projects that we have currently in the energy sector. It's 112 megawatts of solar to be installed at 2 separate sites. And it's the largest installation in CARICOM. And the PPA, or the Power Purchase Agreement, is of course the lowest in CARICOM by far. So it's extremely competitive. But there is a catch to Project Lara, however. Well, the size of both these two locations, or these two installations, it's around 3 times the area of the Queen's Park Savannah. And Project Lara, on average, is around 10% of our peak demand. It's probably a little less. And it's around 5.3% of our installed capacity. So utility scale solar in this current form does take up a lot of land space. We live in a small island. Land is important for us. We have a priority for land space for housing. We also have a priority to use our land space for commercial and industrial activities. We also talk about agriculture. So it's very difficult to invest in more utility scale solar projects that would consume as much land space as Project Lara. So if you want to power all of Trinidad and Tobago using solar, from a very simple arithmetic, it might be around 32 times the size of the Queen's Park Savannah. So what is our approach? Well, if we have a problem with land space, then most definitely the answer is distributed solar or rooftop solar. And this is under the remit of the RIC, actually. So I just want to draw your attention to what's going on in Australia. And this is actually last month, November. And let us focus on South Australia. They generated close to 1,300 megawatts using rooftop solar. Our peak demand is around 1,300 megawatts. So this is a nice example. So solar could potentially solve, or at least distributed rooftop solar could solve the issue we have with land space. And if you want an example closer to home, we could look at Barbados. Barbados has roughly around 100 megawatts of solar installed and planned. And they would not have used up as much space that we would have used up with our utility scale solar, because they do have a considerable amount of rooftop distributed solar. But you see, there's a problem with solar. It's available during the day. And to support our petrochemical industry and our oil and gas industries, we need an energy source that is available almost 24/7. And wind energy is that solution. So we have either offshore wind or onshore wind. And we have a problem if we look at onshore wind again. And the problem is land space. Not only land space, but you get a lower cost for energy for wind if you go bigger. And to get more bigger wind turbines, then you run into the problems of land ownership, and you run into the problems of restrictions with road size and logistics. So if you are to invest in wind, it, for us, has to be offshore wind. Offshore wind turbines are one of the largest in the world, and you get more bang for your buck in terms of investment. You get a lower cost of electricity. And we would not potentially have the issues that we currently have with limited land space. Because you are using such vast and large wind turbines with a higher power capacity offshore, then we are able to provide the required power that could be utilized by our petrochemical industry. These are some preliminary results from a project that I'm involved in with the National Gas Company, where we are doing a desktop study to look at offshore wind for locations in and around Trinidad and Tobago. These are preliminary results, and the public document should be released soon. I want to bring your attention to the Gulf of Paria. So this is right offshore the Point Lisius Industrial Estate. So you can see there's a potential, offshore potential of around 750 megawatts. And this would most definitely suffice as a power source for our petrochemical industry, our oil and gas and manufacturing sectors. Sorry. Why is offshore wind relevant for us as well? Well, we sort of have we are very advanced in the technical capabilities for offshore wind. We have been fabricating offshore platforms and large offshore platforms for some time now, and we have been very successful at it. We have quite a number of companies that specialize in offshore services for the offshore platforms and offshore industry that we have. And we have ports that are fitted and suitable for the offshore industry and also for the petrochemical industry. So there is this local expertise, there is this local talent, there are local companies we currently have that can support a future offshore wind project or a nascent offshore industry in Trinidad and Tobago. And granted, we would have to upgrade our ports because some of these wind turbines are very much larger and they would require some sort of port upgrade, but most definitely, we do not start at zero when it comes to offshore wind. So we will take offshore wind. We can, of course, use the solar we have onshore and during the day. It will be fed through a process called electrolysis, a very simple process that involves distilled water and electricity. And the output of that is hydrogen. That hydrogen can be used as a green feedstock for our petrochemical industry and specifically to produce green ammonia and green methanol. And this prepares us for the energy transition that's coming. This prepares our petrochemical industry for a green future. So we could have continued development in the petrochemical industry if we move towards offshore wind and green hydrogen. We can also start back or look at starting back our steel production. Hydrogen can be a replacement for a raw material called coke, which we use for steel production. And you can produce green steel. Swedish car manufacturer Volvo, they are already using green steel in their cars. So they have a fleet of cars that is made for green steel. So there's the opportunity as well to bring back a sector that has been dormant in Trinidad for some time. Now, there are some downsides to the entire process of electrolysis. Electrolyzers that are commercially available today have an efficiency of around 60 to 70%. So what that means is that we lose a lot of our valuable renewable energy in the process of electrolysis to produce hydrogen. We are moving from one energy carrier to the next, and we have losses, and these losses are sort of significant. So when we undertake these projects, it's very important to do a proper techno-economic study to ensure that we are getting value for our resources. There is another process called molten oxide electrolysis that bypasses the need for hydrogen for the production of green steel, but I would admit to you this is an emerging technology. But what it does, it avoids the efficiency losses that you would have with the process of electrolysis. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that there are a lot of emerging technologies that would utilize electricity direct from renewable energy that can benefit our industry and our petrochemical sector. There is a sector that typically is not as discussed as often when you talk about climate change and the effects of climate change, and that is the agriculture sector. Now, the global population is increasing, our own population in Trinidad is increasing, and there is a need for food security, particularly as it relates to protein. So currently we get our proteins from animals. The use of animal for protein is very costly. We use up a lot of land space, we use up a lot of water, and agriculture is responsible for a considerable amount of emissions through methane, especially animals that we rear for protein. So there is quite a number of technologies that are already commercially available today that utilize microbes for the production of animal proteins. And one of the technologies I'm highlighting is precision fermentation. These are products on the market already. So they are using microbes to create cow milk for the production. They're using it in this case for ice cream. This is a protein powder. Now, what's a next revolutionary approach is by this company called Every. They are focusing on egg protein, more specifically the white egg whites, and they teamed up with the largest beer manufacturer in the world, Anheuser-Busch. Remember, so their core business is a form of fermentation. So they teamed up with this the largest beer manufacturer in order to produce this egg whites in a large scale. So it will be cheap and competitive. Now, I believe this is very much applicable for us in Trinidad and Tobago. The reason being, we have a very mature and successful food manufacturing sector. For a long time, we have been brewing our own beers, and we have a successful rum sector. So whatever the problems that we have in agriculture, and for whatever reasons we find traditional agriculture unappetizing, we could move towards producing protein, not only to feed ourselves, but to potentially export in a scale that is equivalent to our petrochemical plants. So we don't necessarily need the large amount of land space that we would require if we were to rear animal protein. And we could mass produce and utilize our local expertise as it relates to this technology. Now, if you feel that this is something new to Trinidad, you're not entirely right. This is the pilot plant facility at the UTT Point Lisas campus. And in 2013, we were able to produce animal protein using natural gas as a feedstock. So there is the capability locally for us to restart the agriculture sector, focusing on alternative forms of protein and where it could be done in an industrial or petrochemical scale. So to summarize and to answer the question that I posed high up, where I said that we can commit to net zero by 2050. We could invest in alternative proteins, and I outlined We are not starting at zero. So our goal is to reach net zero, but we don't have to start at zero. Of course, we could declare our net zero targets. The Honorable Minister spoke about the feed-in tariff that will enable distributed solar and rooftop solar. We are not starting at zero over there. We are in the process of producing an e-mobility policy. We have rolled out incentives for EVs. Electrification of transportation is on its way. We are not starting at zero there as well. In terms of offshore wind, we need to invest in a bankable offshore wind resource assessment. Once that bankable wind resource assessment is available, you make that results public. And to follow the Dutch model, just like how we have bidding rounds for our offshore resources of oil and gas, when you publicize your offshore wind resource, you can invite companies to bid on this offshore wind resource. Very much similar to what we currently do for our offshore gas. Once we establish an offshore wind farm, we could use that power to power our petrochemical industries to produce green ammonia and green methanol. And we could restart our steel production, and instead of producing steel, we could produce green steel from that hydrogen. You could also look at a more sustainable way to produce cement, although I'm not covering that, but we do have a cement industry. So my final takeaway is this. We are SID. We are the most vulnerable as it relates to climate change. We have an oil and gas sector that is essential for our survival. We can still keep our highly industrialized ways by embracing the energy transition, by embracing technologies that are currently available, and still be able to make a net zero commitment. And we owe it for our future generations. We owe it for the survival of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and I look forward to your questions in the session.
Thank you, Curtis, for a very thought-provoking presentation and for pointing out the opportunities and challenges existing locally. And already we've gotten one question posed to you from our viewers, and we welcome viewers to pose any additional questions to you that we will answer later on. I again remind our viewers that your questions are welcome. For the viewers on Zoom, please send your questions using the question and answer feature. And for viewers on Facebook, you can use the chat facility. Our third guest speaker is Mr. Courtenay Mark, who's a registered electrical engineer with the local Board of Engineering of Trinidad and Tobago, and has 37 years electric utility experience in power system operations and planning. As a senior executive manager and recently retired chief technical officer at the Trinidad and Tobago Electricity Commission TNTEC, Mr. Mark has a very deep knowledge of power purchase agreements, both for fossil fuel as well as renewable energy sources. He brings a wealth of experience in matters relating to energy efficiency, both from the power generation standpoint as well as power utilization. He is well in touch with energy-related matters throughout the Caribbean and is well informed on market prices and trends, both through the eyes of the customer, the service provider, and the other stakeholders in the energy sector here in Trinidad and Tobago. He has a Bachelor of Science degree with honors and an advanced postgraduate diploma in his field of electrical engineering and energy systems. He has served as a director on the boards of the Power Generation Company of Trinidad and Tobago, as well as on the board of the Association of Caribbean Electric Utilities, CARELEC. His topic is on energy efficiency initiatives available to individuals and companies in Trinidad and Tobago, and the role to be played by renewable energy technologies. I now invite Mr. Mark to begin his presentation.
Thank you very much, Wendell, for the kind introduction. I think we have established protocols this morning, all protocols observed. Good morning to all those present here at the Hyatt and those viewing our webinar online. So in a sense, I am coming into bat at position number 5, which is the middle order of the batting lineup. And I think based on the opening stand given by our minister and our chairman, Mrs. Dawn Callender, and the other 2 previous speakers, I think I can play my shots somewhat more freely. So I would go through my opening presentation somewhat quickly to get down to the meat and make up some time for this morning's webinar. I particularly found my opening slide somewhat interesting. Why would I choose to put a cow on an opening slide? You know, I found in this particular picture here that the backdrop, the sky, you're not sure if it is day or night. There's a field that looks somewhat barren. There's a wind turbine suggesting some consideration to renewable energy. To me, the cow at one time was white because there was part of his forehead white. He is now turned brown. So there's some confusion taking place in this picture. And maybe that presents somewhat where we are, maybe, in this transition from the effects of global warming and where we would really like to be in a future for generations to survive. The comments that I make this morning are my personal comments. They're not necessarily comments shared by the RIC. So I take some liberties as I proceed with the presentation. I think we have made the point that electric energy efficiency and the reduction of greenhouse gases are inextricably linked. I think Dr. Boodoo made that point quite clearly. And I think that the chairman would have indicated that in the global context, the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions come from the burning of fossil fuels for electricity, heating, and transportation. These together contribute to approximately 55% of global CO2. The other fallout activities from industries, agriculture, and domestic practices make up the balance. This slide simply illustrates when we speak about global warming and the greenhouse gas effects, how greenhouse gases prevent the escape of a portion of the reflected infrared rays, causing this to remain trapped within the Earth's atmosphere. And this is happening simultaneously as excess UV rays enter through depletions in the Earth's protective outer ozone layer, also contributing to warming and climate change. So these two activities are happening simultaneously. Now, the main ozone-depleting substances are chlorofluorocarbons, hydrochlorofluorocarbons, halons, and other combinations of carbon, methane, and fluorides. Now, these are mainly found in industrial cleaners and solvents, air-conditioned refrigerants, and aerosols. On the other hand, greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxides, which are closely associated with power generation. This slide attempts to demonstrate the relationship between various fuels used in electricity generation and their contributions to CO2 emissions. Natural gas, on average, contributes approximately 201 grams of CO2 for every unit of electricity generated, every kilowatt hour. LPG, by comparison, runs second with 227, gasoline 250, and we could go all the way down the line. But relatively speaking, the percentage of CO2 above that emitted by burning natural gas, when you look at, for example, crude oil, you would see 31% above natural gas. Diesel, light fuel oil, which is used extensively throughout the region, our CARICOM neighbors use a lot of diesel and bunker fuel, heavy fuel oils, 39% above the natural gas used in Trinidad. Trinidad uses natural gas almost exclusively. But when you come to hard coal, it is 76% above the amount of CO2 emitted per kilowatt of natural gas used for generation. So one will say that Trinidad is quite efficient, or is in fact not contributing based on the fuel use to the CO2 globally. But in terms of absolute numbers, when you look at the Caribbean countries to the right, Anguilla and these other countries listed, the annual energy utilized in Trinidad is above 8,000 gigawatt hours per year. Our other Caribbean countries, Anguilla is very small, they just use about 87 gigawatts per year, gigawatt hours. Jamaica, while several times bigger than Trinidad, only utilize 3,000 plus gigawatt hours annually. So if we are using in excess of 8,000 gigawatt hours of electricity annually in Trinidad, although we use the cleanest burning fossil fuel, the carbon dioxides contributed must be given consideration. So what's this connection between industrialization and CO2 emissions? On a per capita basis, Trinidad is rubbing shoulders with some of the highest consumers of electricity. These countries include, but are not limited to, the United States and North America, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and the developed European countries. Of significance, though, those countries burn great amounts of coal, consequently contributing to 60% more CO2 per kilowatt hour when compared to Trinidad and Tobago's use of a cleaner burning fossil fuel, that is natural gas. Unfortunately, Trinidad and Tobago does not enjoy the income levels per capita as these developed countries. And this may suggest that the value added based on electricity consumed in Trinidad and Tobago is relatively small. Chairman Dawn Callender, in her opening remarks, alluded to the degree of reservation expressed by large developed countries. And I have chosen this picture to the bottom right to depict a thought-provoking image as to the position we find ourselves, not being able to have the kinds of capital available to do the kinds of initiatives that we will be looking at later in this presentation. TNT's electricity consumption amounts for approximately 0.005% of the global CO2. Although TNT is a signatory to the 2015 Paris Agreement, which we alluded to, which has its targets, and more recently has committed to becoming net zero carbon. We can look at some examples of what is being done, and I've chosen the Central American country of Belize to illustrate how they have used a production mix to get relatively low carbon emissions. It must be recognized, though, that Belize is positioned with neighbors where they can interconnect, whereas Trinidad is an island, and we have very, very limited interconnection capabilities. But in Belize, they get 46% of their electricity through hydro, 13% through biomass, and there's an interconnection with Mexico, which gives them about 37%. So they are able to leverage what they can produce indigenously together with what their neighbors can support them with. Basically, what this has done is allow Belize to have a very attractive electricity rate relative to their Central American neighbors, and at the same time enjoy an electricity rate that is lower than the average electricity rate in the Caribbean. Still, though, Belize has set themselves a target to achieve 85% of their electricity through renewable energy by 2030. So there is a push to improve their efficiency. But while all of that is happening, and Trinidad is making its efforts to move in the direction of reducing carbon, Trinidad, however, has an electricity rate of approximately 6.5 US cents per kilowatt hour. So it does present some confusion in our minds, and I've chosen the pictures below to demonstrate what looks like a very complicated transfer function. And I hope that our viewers are not doing like my friend in the picture below. Is he asleep or is he concentrating on what is being said? So let's look at some electricity conservation tips. Chairman Dawn Callender did indicate some of those in her presentation, so too did Dr. Boodoo. But I will reiterate that you can't go wrong following these basic consumer tips. Turn off all lights and appliances when not in use. Use UL-approved energy-efficient appliances. Use energy-efficient light bulbs, example, LEDs. Practice efficiency in the household. For example, turning off hot water when not in use and using other means for drying clothes and things of that sort. Construct homes with roofs insulated to reduce the dependence on air-conditioned units. Use heat-reflective window panes where practical. Use low-volume electric water heaters, or better yet, invest in solar water heaters, a practice well established throughout the Caribbean. Barbados may have taken the lead there. Read your electric meter daily if possible, but build a habit of understanding your daily consumption of electricity. An average 3-bedroom home utilizing about 30 kilowatt hours per day may easily save approximately 3 to 5 kilowatt hours through these very simple measures. We now turn our attention to the initiatives taken at the grid level. Thus far, Trinidad and Tobago benefits from heat recovery steam generation utilizing combined cycle technology to generate 330 megawatts of power. This represents additional power for zero additional gas usage. Mentioned earlier, but worth mentioning again, 112 megawatts of solar PV power is expected to be added to the grid somewhere around 2023, which will produce approximately 220 gigawatts of zero carbon power and reduce CO2 emissions by approximately 3%. TNTech has embarked on a widespread program to replace high-pressure sodium lights with more efficient LED luminaires. The Port of Spain power station, which could no longer keep pace with more efficient technologies, was closed in 2015. TNTech has also attempted to reduce losses on its transmission and distribution system, while at the same time addressing the issue of electricity theft. Together, these may average approximately 8% of electricity generated. So TNTech got a big thumbs up there. You see yellow and black, the color of TNTech's logo, endorsing these efforts made thus far by the electric utility. We now turn our attention to the initiatives taken at the grid level. We had this slide. Yes, some utility possibilities and considerations. The aging, less efficient generating plant at Point Lisas, approximately 50 years old, could be replaced by combined cycle plant on a phased basis. Smart grid systems using information communication technology could be utilized to efficiently control the lighting of roads, playgrounds, and public spaces. Subject to its feasibility, the inclusion of some energy storage capacity, example, batteries, compressed air energy storage, as well as pump hydro, where the geography permits, should also be considered. The overall benefits of including energy storage from the power generation standpoint are frequency regulation, voltage support, and importantly, the enabling of higher penetration of renewable energy. So this sets a sort of platform on which you can build on the inclusion of renewable energy. Turning our attention to some pricing signals for investors, if you were to look at combined cycle gas turbines, these would come in at a capital expenditure of around $1,200 per kilowatt, with an operating O&M cost in the order of $10 per kilowatt per year. Solar panels are a very good consideration, and we are seeing where you can get upwards of 6 kilowatt hours per day per meter squared. Dr. Boodoo did indicate that while the pricing is quite attractive, the slight downside is the amount of space, because you require close to 2 hectares or so per megawatt of power. In the case of the solar, you would be investing about $1 million per megawatt, which is coming down to approach that of the simple cycle gas turbine technology. Dr. Boodoo also referred to the concept of a few communities doing solar projects, but there are a larger scale opportunity to do community solar, which is very encouraging with an attractive return for small investors. Wind power we touched on earlier, that would come in at about $2,500 to $2,600 per kilowatt. So it is almost 2.5 times the price of solar, and this is for onshore wind. Offshore wind would be much more expensive, and the power yield, as we had indicated somewhat earlier, depends on the size of the diameter of the rotors and the cube of the wind speed coming through these turbines. Hydropower is a possibility from Guyana. Guyana has the potential to develop what is now very virgin resources, but that has approximately 500 megawatts of power sitting there. And based on hydro prices, it may come in somewhere around 13 to 18 US cents per kilowatt hour. That will require some very long-term planning and some very, very conscious decisions at the political level to be realized. There is also the possibility of waste energy at various scales, and at a large scale, it is estimated that we may have sufficient garbage to generate in excess of 40 megawatts that can be injected onto the grid through various technologies. Of course, waste energy at that scale not only brings power onto the grid, but it does two things. It displaces the use of the valuable natural resource, which is natural gas, and it impacts positively on the environment. At the small scale, we can look at opportunities for some niche potentials for microgrids. This will utilize solar power in combination with battery storage and biofuels for the backup generation. Bagasse and agricultural waste, such as manure slurry from pigs, cows, chickens, banana stems, shrimp heads, shells, and other forms of plant and animal organic waste would now become a fuel. In terms of the electricity and transportation, there is a move towards electric vehicles. Suffice it to say that the present fuel of choice in the transportation sector, public and business sectors, is diesel. But while diesel prices are low, it contributes a certain amount of particulate and toxic gases in the exhaust. We recognize the efforts made to use CNG as a cleaner alternative fuel. However, you can't beat EVs, electric vehicles, because the electricity that is used in these vehicles are converted at a better heat rate or thermal efficiency through large-scale power generation than the conversion of CNG through the small internal combustion engine. So with electric vehicles, you stand to save another 20% or so from the energy that you would have otherwise utilized. A few carbon reduction solutions. One would be a higher penetration of combined cycle generating plant, the introduction of renewable energy, solar, wind, hydro, alternative fuels. We spoke about hydrogen, waste to energy, and biofuels. And for those people who may think that you can just take hydrogen and just use it as a fuel, it is very purpose specific. So this hydrogen is not something you can just put into a vehicle. This is hydrogen, in the case of the transport sector, that works in tandem with a battery. And this hydrogen is fed into fuel cells. So it is not just that you can replace CNG or gasoline with hydrogen. I just wanted to clear up that if people were not familiar when we say hydrogen is an alternative fuel. Moving right along, given the time that we have available, we would want to look at some not getting this. So in closing, let's look at some thoughts and issues for consideration. We may wish to consider the launch of an efficiency and demand-side management sensitization campaign. We will want to consider the introduction of a time of use tariff in tandem with renewable energy penetration. So hitherto, there may have been consideration to peak shaving, but I am making this observation in the context of the utilization of renewable energy in a future to possibly come. We may want to create an enabling environment to permit community solar projects. We will also want to encourage open grid access for all licensed renewable energy generators, subject to power purchase agreements with TNTech. Reference was made to a feed-in tariff. The sooner that can come would be the better to enable people willing to so invest in solar. We may want to start laying down the groundwork for the implementation of a carbon tax regime that would generate internationally tradable carbon credits. Reference to this tax structure was not made previously in this discussion, but it is an obvious outcome if you have to account for the contributions being made for carbon reduction in one form or the other. We will want to consider placing on the legislative agenda that generation expansion ought to obtain regulatory approval before tendering. ESCOs, which are energy service companies, could be recognized through certification with a decoupled tariff structure incentivizing energy efficiency, such that ESCOs will be remunerated based on shared savings with their clients. Incentives should be put in place for electric vehicles in the public transportation sector. So in closing, my final comment would be that at the end of the day, the regulatory environment and the pricing signals will ultimately shape consumer behavior. I wish to thank the RIC for giving me the opportunity to present here this morning, and also thank the audience listening for the courtesy of your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Courtenay, for clearly indicating a way forward and food for thought as Trinidad and Tobago seeks to advance energy efficiency, energy conservation, and renewable energy integration. We now have 70-odd attendees on Zoom, and I urge you to have your family and colleagues log in so that they can see and participate in the rest of our webinar. Thank you. We are now at the stage of the program where members of the staff of the RIC will present on the local regulatory aspects and the work of the RIC has been doing to promote energy efficiency, energy conservation, and the integration of renewable energy sources into the country's energy portfolio. I welcome Mr. Victor Rodriguez, Standards Engineer at the RIC, to begin his presentation on advancing energy efficiency and energy conservation in Trinidad and Tobago.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the RIC team, I would like to present the topic of energy efficiency and energy conservation in Trinidad and Tobago, as these are the core imperatives for sustainable energy planning. Further to this, they can be considered the necessary stepping stones towards the anticipated energy transition. The structure of this presentation will discuss the case for energy efficiency and energy conservation and the current state of efforts in Trinidad and Tobago with respect to the progress of uptake, inclusive of the challenges. We will end with the RIC's proposed approach for advancing its uptake in Trinidad and Tobago. The advancement of energy efficiency and energy conservation remains at the center of international policy discussions, such as COP26 and the 2021 International Conference on Sustainable Development, as they can give us the ability to reduce energy costs, minimize greenhouse gas emissions, and mitigate the impacts of climate change. The outcomes of the discussion suggest that as nations, we are not collectively doing enough to advance energy efficiency and energy conservation uptake. As a result, Trinidad and Tobago and other small island developing states, which are on the front line of the adverse effects of climate change, can face long-term and permanent consequences in the near future. Accordingly, there have been calls by many world leaders for greater collective actions to achieve our commitments to the Paris Agreement and Sustainable Development Goal 7. Our Prime Minister has specifically noted that there must be a paradigm shift and renewed focus on renewables and sustainable electrification, whilst improving efficiency and reducing emissions. The objective of this presentation is to give the audience a greater appreciation for the potential of energy efficiency and energy conservation. Because they are the baseline categories for the shift to renewables, they are considered essential to international policy discussions regarding the implementation of renewables, such as we have recently seen. As an economic regulator of the electricity sector, the RIC has always held energy efficiency and energy conservation matters in high regard, as they ultimately have a role in influencing tariffs and pricing regimes within the electricity sector. The RIC seeks to encourage national dialogue on these matters, particularly at the policy formulation level, while sensitizing the key stakeholders for its advancement locally. As we move on to discuss the state of energy efficiency and energy conservation efforts in Trinidad and Tobago, there have been several strategies and initiatives which aid its advancement. From the policy perspective, there's the initiative to integrate renewable energy on the grid while simultaneously decommissioning traditional generation capacity that has passed its lifespan. One such project is the utility-scale solar project that Mr. Mark mentioned. In terms of institutional structure for energy efficiency and energy conservation, there has been the establishment of various national working committees to address related matters. Apart from this, laws and regulations also have a role to play, as they are the bedrock and basis of the institutional structure, as this is what governs and identifies the responsibilities of the relevant parties. For example, the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards is one of the parties, and it is in the process of developing national energy efficiency standards for certain electrical devices. Additionally, the RIC is involved in the implementation of pricing regimes that reflect the true cost of electricity. Financial incentives have also been implemented in the form of tax credits on energy efficient equipment for residential and commercial customers, such as solar water heaters. While these incentives are mainly tangible, public awareness and education remains equally important, as these ground citizens with the understanding that energy efficiency and energy conservation practices will ultimately benefit them as the electricity consumers. As mentioned by the Honorable Minister, the government recently embarked on some new measures to reduce emissions and build climate resilience. Some of these measures can help to further boost energy efficiency and conservation uptake including the recent development of an e-mobility policy, intentions to renew RE targets and increase the uptake to 30% by 2030, and intentions to explore the use of industry-generated carbon dioxide. Despite the mentioned strategies and initiatives, the advancement of energy efficiency and energy conservation in Trinidad and Tobago continues to be hampered in many ways, such as the absence of formal energy efficiency and conservation policies or the establishment of poorly drafted policy. Absent or weak institutional structure to determine the suite of energy efficiency and energy conservation programs and activities. Inadequate support and financing for energy efficiency and energy conservation programs, the absence of cost-reflective electricity prices, and the high electricity consumption, typically due to consumer behavior. In keeping with the best practices and lessons learned, the RIC notes that reform within the energy sector is currently necessary to promote the efficient use of energy of Trinidad and Tobago's natural gas resources, as well as to establish sustainable mechanisms to advance and finance the implementation of energy efficiency and energy conservation initiatives. In this regard, the RIC proposes key activities to address the major challenges that hinder energy efficiency and conservation advancement locally. This includes a focus on holistic approach with the full involvement of all stakeholders and significantly improved coordination across the relevant sectors. This approach will include the formulation of policy and mandate by the government that will define how this sector will be structured. Although the policy rollout will outline the appropriate governance frameworks and financing mechanisms, the activities should not stop here, as the needed legislation will create the required enabling environment. The modification of consumer behavior must also be addressed with various incentive mechanisms through the coordinated efforts of the government, RIC, TNTech, and NGOs. To sufficiently advance energy efficiency and energy conservation uptake, the RIC wishes to put forward specific actions to be undertaken by 3 key stakeholders, namely the government, TNTech, and the RIC. Firstly, the recommended actions for the government include establishing energy efficiency and energy conservation policy, which should be aligned with international commitments, establishing national energy efficiency and energy intensity targets based on the estimated reduction of current electricity consumption levels of various consumer classes, assessing and making appropriate changes to the current institutional structure with respect to the national energy efficiency objective, renewing relevant legislation which pertain to electricity generation to address any legislative issues and new legislation arising from the adoption of energy efficiency and energy conservation practices, examining and instituting direct and indirect public benefits mechanisms through rebates and subsidies commensurate with the achievable potential for cost-effective energy efficiency, promoting energy efficiency initiatives through import restrictions, tax deductions on energy efficient appliances and trade-in programs, and implementing a comprehensive public awareness campaign on energy efficiency and energy conservation practices. Moving on to the second key stakeholder, the RIC recommends several actions to be undertaken by TNTech, such as applying frameworks that integrate demand-side efficiency measures into the assessment of overall strategic scenarios to meet electricity-related energy service needs as part of a comprehensive integrated resource plan, adjusting all electricity billing cycles from a bi-monthly to a monthly period in order to provide TNTech customers with a better appreciation of the cost of their monthly energy use rates, and exploring the feasibility of a demand-side management program structured around the existing advanced metering infrastructure aimed at modifying the behavior of electricity consumers. Thirdly, the RIC notes its role in the advancement of energy efficiency and energy conservation uptake locally, and recognizes that it needs to undertake key actions, such as ensuring that prices signal the value to consumers and society of efficiency in the consumption of electricity, examining utility-based energy efficiency initiatives to ensure that outlays are prudent and effective. That being said, all investment for these energy efficiency initiatives must be included in calculating regulated revenue. Lastly, conducting regulatory impact assessments of the impact of energy efficiency and energy conservation initiatives and targets where necessary to balance the fundamental goals of affordability, cost recovery, and fairness of regulatory objectives specified in the legislative frameworks. In closing, we would like to thank you all for your attention and hand the floor back over to the moderator.
Thank you, Victor. We will now hear from Ms. Leah Goddard-Pierre, Senior Tariff Analyst, as she discusses the actions towards the Government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago's climate change commitments. You have the floor, Leah.
Good morning, everyone. My presentation outlines actions towards government's climate change commitments. Firstly, I will speak about the RIC's responsibility towards climate change commitments and the RIC's action in that regard. And finally, I will outline considerations for consumers to reduce their emissions. So the RIC Act explicitly states that the RIC, in the conduct of its functions, must have regard to current national environmental policy. Also, since the government is a major stakeholder in the electricity sector, the RIC must consider government's policy for the sector in drafting regulations. The government's climate change commitments has major implications for costs and operations in the sector. The RIC's actions are guided by its Act, and 3 of its legislative functions have been identified as the main instruments which can be used towards achieving government's climate change commitments. The RIC can utilize its pricing function to encourage energy efficiency and ensure renewable energy investments are adequately incentivized. Under its duty to advise the minister, the RIC may advise on policy for RE and EE measures. The RIC must also ensure that there is energy efficiency on the supply side, as the RIC Act states that the RIC must ensure to maximum efficiency in the use and allocation of resources. In terms of the RIC's actions with respect to RE integration in Trinidad and Tobago, the RIC sits on the Feed-in Tariff Committee that has a mandate to develop a feed-in tariff policy which will give citizens an opportunity to participate in the RE market. Currently, the committee is working with a consultant to finalize an implementation plan for the policy. With the implementation of the FIT policy, the RIC is likely to have a further role in setting FIT rates in accordance with the RIC Act. The RIC has also worked on an IDB project to develop a licensing framework for utility-scale RE, and that project started in the 3rd quarter of 2020 and was completed in March this year. The output of that project included a legislative review, gap analysis, and licensing framework report. Recommendations were also made for amendments to both the RIC Act and TNTEC Act. A standard form license document was also produced. The RIC also continues to provide advice to the Ministry of Public Utilities in keeping with its mandate. So the RIC's action with respect to EE on the supply side was initiated with the development of a performance monitoring reporting scheme for power generation in Trinidad and Tobago. And the final decision was published in January 2019. The RIC supply of electricity order was published in the Gazette in July 2021, and this means that the RIC can now collect data under that scheme. The scheme is intended to contribute to the promotion of economic efficiency, reliability, energy security, and transparency within the sector. The scheme is intended to contribute to, with the data collected under that scheme, greater efforts can be made towards improving energy efficiency of generators for existing and new PPAs. The RIC's actions regarding energy efficiency on the demand side involves a number of measures. An energy audit study of selected schools in environs of Port of Spain was conducted in 2016. And out of those audits, several energy cost reduction measures were recommended to each school. In addition to those, further recommendations were made to the Ministry of Education to consider undertaking measures to establish a unit in the ministry to perform facility management, metering, and measurement procedures for water and energy throughout schools in Trinidad and Tobago to advance energy efficiency and energy conservation in schools. Also, at the policy level, staff discussion papers were published in 2019 outlining recommendations for energy efficiency, electric vehicle, and battery storage in Trinidad and Tobago. The RIC has continuously undertaken customer education initiatives, and brochures on energy conservation and energy efficiency have been published and circulated to customers via several mediums. In terms of pricing, the RIC has a duty to ensure that prices send the correct signals to customers regarding the cost of electricity to encourage energy efficiency and in the consumption of electricity. In 2006, the RIC implemented an inclining block tariff structure for residential customers. And the feature of this tariff structure is that the more you use, the higher the average price. The inclining block structure sought to provide a lifeline tariff for basic needs consumption for lower income customers and also aimed to encourage energy efficiency. As higher energy consumption customers of the utility face increasingly higher charges based on electricity usage. At that time, the RIC had assessed subsistence consumption to be 400 kilowatt hours on a bi-monthly basis, and a three-tiered structure was established as shown in the table. So the RIC continuously analyzes customer demand profiles, and this graph shows average bi-monthly residential kilowatt hour consumption in Trinidad and Tobago over the period 2016 to 2020. What we see is that there was a slight reduction in average bi-monthly demand between 2016 and 2018, and consecutive increases in 2019 and 2020, which coincided with work from home measures as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. A comparison of bi-monthly residential consumption shows that Trinidad and Tobago consumption in Trinidad and Tobago is more than 3 times that of households in Jamaica, Grenada, St. Lucia, and almost twice that of Antigua, which is closer to Trinidad and Tobago in terms of per capita GDP. So this table shows residential electricity consumption for a bi-monthly period, November 1st to December 31st, 2017. Customers have been disaggregated by the range of their bi-monthly kilowatt-hour consumption. And we see that there's a small group of customers, approximately 25%, consuming over 1,500 kilowatt hours on a bi-monthly basis. And these customers account for 57% of the total consumption by residential customers. Also, 15% of customers consuming over 2,000 kilowatt hours on a bi-monthly basis account for 43% of total consumption of residential customers. A look at the same bi-monthly period for 2020 shows that residential customer base increased by 5%, but overall consumption increased by, the number of customers increased by 5%, but overall consumption increased by 15% from 2017 to 2020. We see again that a small group of customers are consuming, or 30% of them are consuming over 1,500 kilowatt hours on a bi-monthly basis, and they account for 63% of total consumption by residential customers. Also, 19% of customers are consuming over 2,000 kilowatt hours, and they account for 50% of total consumption of residential customers. So based on the analysis of customer consumption data and RIC's pricing objectives, the RIC proposes to make 2 amendments to the residential customer tariff and billing structure. Firstly, we propose to move to the current bi-monthly billing cycle to a monthly cycle, and we believe that a monthly billing cycle may ease the burden on low-income consumers on the basis that they would better be able to align their monthly expenditure on utilities with earnings, which is oftentimes received monthly. More frequent billing also allows consumers to make adjustments more quickly. The RIC also proposes to add an additional tier to the inclining block structure, and the proposed consumption bands are shown in the table. With the proposed inclining blocks, larger users will pay more for each unit of consumption within each succeeding consumption band. The hope is that the 2 proposed changes to residential tariff structure would encourage energy efficiency, savings, and emissions reductions. Time of use tariffs, which incentivize customers to shift their electricity use from high to low demand periods, are also being considered by the RIC in its current review of electricity tariffs. So there are several considerations for customers to reduce their electricity consumption and emissions that are well known by many, but still there's not a wide uptake. Most of these are raised by previous speakers, so I will not go into the details. I will only draw your attention to the last bullet on this slide, which speaks of a launch of an application by TNTech. TNTech launched its energy management application in 2020, and the app is a useful tool to residential customers and commercial customers for reducing their electricity usage. The app provides data for 24 months of consumers' cost, usage, environmental impact, and allows customers to track historical patterns, manage accounts, and set usage goals. I encourage our audience who are customers of the utility to make use of the application. It is a valuable tool to help adjust behaviors and also empower customers to take control of their electricity bills and their environmental footprint. In closing, I reiterate that the RIC is mindful of its role in achieving the country's goal of emissions reductions. The RIC is committed to doing its part in terms of customer education. We will continue to make information digestible for public consumption. We will continue to utilize pricing as a strategy to encourage efficient use of energy and to incentivize RE, and we will continue to advise on policy towards achieving government's climate change commitments. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Leah. There is still time, viewers, to send in your questions using the question and answer feature on Zoom and the chat feature on Facebook. I just want to address one request we got from Ms. Spencer, where she asked to be shown the slide from Mr. Mark's presentation to reduce energy consumption. Ms. Spencer, if you can kindly share your email address with us so that we can forward Mr. Mark's presentation to you so that you can benefit from the wealth of knowledge that he shared in his presentation. Thank you. At this time, we shall begin the panel discussion and also respond to the questions posed by you, our viewers. Our panelists are Mr. Glenn Kahn, the Executive Director of the RIC, and Mr. Courtenay Mark, who was one of our presenters earlier, who are both on stage with me, and along with Dr. Curtis Boodoo and Dr. Jean-Michel Palais, who will be joining us remotely, will form the panel. So panelists, there's been a resounding call for action by world leaders, and I now ask you, what steps should one consider can be taken regionally and locally to achieve, for countries, Caribbean nations, to achieve their nationally determined contributions, and well, more specifically, what steps could probably be taken within the energy sector? I'd like first probably Dr. Boodoo and Mr. Pal to respond, and then we will get comments from our panelists here on stage with me. Dr. Boodoo?
Okay, sure. Thank you for the question, Cornell. I'm aware of a lot of member states in CARICOM who have already actually submitted their second NDCs. So they would have submitted their first, and earlier this year would have submitted their second. And they would have went through in-depth analysis as it relates to their first NDCs and where they currently, what the status is, and where they should be in their revised NDCs. So a lot of good work has been going on in the region with regards to that. I'm probably not the best person placed to answer that with regards to Trinidad, where we are with the revision of our first NDC. Most definitely there are persons who could speak about that better than I can. But I could say that there have been a use of long-term modeling software tools in the region to guide countries when making their NDC revision. So the use of evidence-based or decision-making tools are currently being used and utilized. And I expect this to be the case with Trinidad as well. So I hope my answer helps.
It does. Mr. Pal, would you like to respond to the question?
Yeah, I will add to Dr. Boodoo's response and just say I think he started down the right road. I'm a huge proponent of planning, hence the focus of my presentation today. So number one, I do think the point he raised about analytical, evidence-based, data-driven. I had a slide in my presentation focus on that. That absolutely needs to take front and center stage. They need to be informed targets. We need to understand that we can meet them, and that needs to be underpinned by an analysis that drives that. Now, sometimes the deeper and more detailed analysis might be happening sectorally. So back again to the presentation, I would endorse strong linkages to be built between the various agencies with responsibility for these efforts, and as well some of the other agencies with sectoral responsibilities. Other than that, quite prosaic recommendations. Tracking will be important. We need to understand where we cannot attain some of the targets we've set. And then lastly, of course, in today's presentations from all presenters, we've had a suite of ways and approaches we can take once we establish those targets we want to meet, and we look at how we can achieve them. There's a bunch of different things we can leverage, and those will be specific to the countries in question. So yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. Courtenay, would you like to weigh in?
I think what has been said about the targets and so are somewhat quite obvious, but how do you measure performance when you're talking about energy efficiency and carbon emissions? And it comes down to a bit of chemistry as well. If you in the generation sector, you're burning fuel, some target on heat rate, which is the conversion, the effective conversion of the energy in the fuel used to produce electricity, has to be taken into account. So in the case of the electricity generating sector, not only in Trinidad, but across the world, you'll want to establish how many kilojoules per kilowatt hour is being utilized in the generation production of electricity. On the consumer end, particularly large industries and the manufacturing sector, having produced that electricity to some standard of efficiency, you now want to know how well it is being utilized. And this is where some econometric models will come in, so that if a producer or a manufacturer were to come into Trinidad and felt that they can just use electricity that appears to be cheap relative to world prices, but their technology is not efficient, then in a sense they are wasting our electricity and producing CO2, which is to our demise. So we have to establish standards to say that for 1 ton of your product, based on some efficiencies and econometric models, you ought to utilize a certain amount of electricity. And we need to start sending the signals that if you're going to come to this country and underutilize our resource to our demise, you have to have penalties. And it is for this reason I alluded to the discussion that would start to generate something along tax credits. Of course, those people who are more efficient will contribute to our carbon credits. But those who don't contribute would be penalized where they feel it in their pockets. And it is those signals and that environment that requires the courage to move us as a country if we are to meet those global targets.
Thank you, Mr. Mark. Mr. Khan, would you like to respond?
I would just like to begin where Courtenay ended, basically, and I'll be brief. And really, the consumers who are largely the people who use up all of this energy and so on, they don't seem to feature much in the discussion, because it's always at the higher level that you hear these discussions about what people should do and what they shouldn't do. What we have to do is to find some way to get those people in the conversation and to get them to accept the realities that are presented, because a lot of us don't believe that these things are real. And I think that we need to spend a lot more time there to try to get, if we want to get to our targets.
Thank you. One of our online questions came in for Mr. Pal, of which he responded online, but I will repeat it and have him also respond so that the other viewers can have benefit of his response. That question cited that he spoke about the IRP and that one of his slides made reference to the transmission planning and another slide made reference to Plexus, which is one of the planning software that can be used. There seems to be a significant overlap with what the local electric utility does for transmission planning. How much overlap is there actually, and what is the strategy to minimize the overlap and double work? So Jean-Michel, I don't know if you would like to respond again. I could quote your response that you typed in, but if you want, you can repeat again. And I'll also like to weigh in as being one of the local technocrats who is currently participating in that process as to what is going to be, what takes place in the process and where the overlap will always exist and how it's trying to be minimized. So Jean-Michel?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So just to recap, the answer I provided at the time was we have some core stakeholders who participate in these processes. The utilities are always one of the core participating stakeholders in the development of the IRPs in any member state. And particularly in the case of a strong utility partner, which is what the person asking the question alluded to, somebody who has a very well-established, in this case, they refer to a transmission planning function. Those plans would actually feed into the IRP. The utility being a stakeholder, first stock is taken of what's actually happening, what plans are developed. So there would not be any negating or tossing out the plans that are there on the ground. Now, what's happened in some cases, obviously what part of the process is testing and occasionally looking to see that either the technical need remains through analysis, or that if a certain action plan or investment plan is developed, and in some cases we've seen it may not necessarily be the most optimal one, particularly on a cost basis. Perhaps a development plan is a little bit early, and when we look at optimal investments, we could have actually pushed back some of those investments. So what we try and do essentially is to add value to what's there on the ground, but particularly with a strong partner with strong technical competence. It's really just seeing where we can add value. And one point I did miss out in that answer, but I'd like to add here live, is just that as well, half of the presentation dealt with adaptation and the vulnerability analysis, and that's a critical element which I think is important for us to inculcate throughout the region. And we're talking about the power sector, but not just in the power sector, any development, construction, anything, project development in general needs to be very sensitive from the earliest inception and early planning days to the risks that we face from climate change and other hazards. So just saying that that's another added value part that's a lot of the times missing, even when you have an extremely strong utility partner with technical competence. Thanks.
Okay, and I'll also like to add that as part of the IRP process, the participating countries, the technocrats are benefiting from capacity building so that the utility, in addition to the regulator, ministry officials, consultants, power generation companies, we're all participating and we're all being exposed to the relevant software that is being used in the process. And the hope is that moving forward after this first initial IRP is developed, that we will have the local capacity and the utility to be able to continue the process. So that is part of some of the work that is going on with the help of CCRI and funding from the international lending agencies. Jean-Michel, I'd like to stay with you where, and also this is related to the IRP process. I'm asking what outcome, what can participating countries right now in the Caribbean, like Trinidad and Tobago, expect when the process is completed? And can you possibly indicate a time horizon? I know that you cannot share any detailed reports, but I think our viewers would be interested to know that the process is underway so that we can have an idea what might be a time horizon. I know it'll be for different for different countries because they are different stages of the process, but if you can share that with us, we'll appreciate it. Thanks.
Sure, I can speak to some of that. So regarding what happens after, To be fair, now this differs by member state, or differs by country in the Caribbean, differs around the world. In some places, you have very strong and clear and definitive regulation that says it might establish a trigger for when you would redo these. I mentioned the iterative process, typically where they exist and they're enshrined in some kind of law or regulation. Some are very prescriptive, so they might say every 3 years you might repeat this process again, and it would be the basis for development in the sector accepted by a regulator, for example. In some cases, a trigger might be, upon request for a rate review or something like this. Further to that, there is typically a process that happens after the plan is developed. There are rules and responsibilities, so it might call, I'm just drawing on examples here from memory. So it could be that the utility is requested to do it, but the regulator set out how that plan should be done. They might be the ones to ultimately accept it. In some places, it's not as defined. And to be fair, I don't want to, so it's kind of hard to answer this timeline, because I can give you some timelines, Colonel, on some of the background processes and when plans might be delivered, but I wouldn't want to prejudice any next steps in country. And where these things are not fully developed, what we do, we have a strong relationship. I mentioned the CARICOM Secretariat and the CARICOM Energy Unit in particular, who supports us as a high-level coordination partner and works with countries. In fact, CCRI gets leverage in countries only after CARICOM gets the formal application and assent by the main country representatives in government. So again, where these things are not well defined, I can't speak to a general way forward. What sometimes happens is cabinet, it might be raised to cabinet for approval. In other cases, in the case of older acts, sometimes the minister has the ability to speak to the planning function and acceptance of plans like that. So unfortunately, I'm sorry, I can't give you a stronger response. I think it actually is something that perhaps requires some input and next steps discussions at a higher level, and also with the major stakeholders in Trinidad, like some of the people who might be on this call. And yeah, timeline. So we're doing internal review on the 2 major work packages, which I showed you through those 2 major streams right now. But again, that's something I actually have to go back to stakeholders in the process with very shortly, within the next week or 2, to update them on. So I also don't want to say too much on this call. I'd rather speak to the stakeholders first and then go from there. But thanks for the opportunity to speak to that.
Thank you. I'm posing this question to both Jean-Michel and Curtis. Based on your experiences, how active is the Caribbean region in achieving climate resilience, and what are some of the positive achievements within the region that our viewers can benefit from?
I think Jean-Michel is very well suited to go first, to have a first crack at that.
All right, to say thank you. So are we, Courtenay, if you could just repeat the first part of the question. Are we on track, or are there success stories?
No, basically I'm asking what positive achievements within the region that are,
with regard to resilience and building resilience, I would say it's, again, I might be accused of falling back on the program I'm promoting, but to be honest, there's a burgeoning recognition worldwide, and it's even a burgeoning field in academia and in practical implementation. So to be fair, I think I could probably point out projects for you that maybe I know from my home country, St. Lucia, things I see in Barbados. For example, I've seen, and utilities have been doing this for a while, so kudos to them. I mean, there's the recognition that they have sensitive and vulnerable assets, and they've been doing certain like asset hardening measures. These are all positive, but to speak to, a holistic action around resilience, I think we're now starting to get to that place. So again, I'm going to fall back on planning. I don't know how satisfactory the answer will be, but to be honest, I see that as a win. The fact that planning is starting to recognize that, and not just planning, because again, I can point to very specific actions. You'll have also, the full gamut of engineers who recognize the civil engineers probably leading the forefront, because a lot of these assets and all these assets are exposed, they're vulnerable. And as well, we have some drivers coming from outside. So sometimes, funding might be tied to ensuring that this is a resilient project. You see a lot more of that nowadays. But yeah, I'm gonna come back to planning. I see that as the best trend right now that's happening. There's a recognition from day one, from the time you're even starting to look at holistic planning for the sector, straight down to implementation. That's my answer.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. Curtis?
Yeah, Jean-Michel gave an excellent answer. I would take some of his advice and talk about some projects. So I am part of the GCC Plus project in Trinidad here with the UNDP, where we are installing solar at 12 locations. There were 2 excellent reports that were done on the region. The report series is called Solar Under Storm. They were undertaken by the Rocky Mountain Institute, Part 1 and Part 2. We used the results of those report when we tendered when we had our tender for equipment for our solar PV installations, because one of the requirements we put in is that the installation should be resilient, at least a Category 2 hurricane. With regards to the diploma in renewable energy that we started last year at UTT, the content from those 2 reports, the Solar Under Storm reports, are taught to our students here at the university. So we are using some of the information as it relates to resilience in the region, specifically to solar systems, in the teaching at UTT and also in projects in Trinidad. Also, there was a recent, a small project in Barbados. There is a technology that electric vehicles can give you. It's called vehicle to grid, but there are a lot of regulatory barriers as it relates to taking power from your electric car battery and putting it back on the grid. A lot of electric vehicle manufacturers.
Can I just interrupt? That would be one of my questions that I will specifically.
I'll try to avoid that. Well, I'll just look. So a lot of car manufacturers have something called vehicle to load to get around the regulatory barriers of trying to put back power on the grid. So you could use your car battery as a source to power a load that you would connect. And Barbados Light and Power did some they had a small project where they purchased a third-party device that would hook up to a Nissan car, and you would get power out of the battery from that. So that adds to resilience, right? So that in the sense that post natural disaster, post hurricane, you could utilize your electric car for some sort of electricity or energy. So those are the 2 examples. I tried my best to stay away from your question, Cornell.
Thanks. And I have a direct question to you from our chairman, and she asks you to speak more on the costs and the benefits for Trinidad and Tobago economically, and in order to achieve net zero as it relates to 1, green hydrogen, 2, blue hydrogen, and 3, gray hydrogen. Thank you, Curtis.
Thank you. I would say my job is answering questions, and I have not gotten a more difficult question like this one. I am unable to provide some sort of substantial answer this time, because that would require most definitely a deep dive into the economics of hydrogen for Trinidad. And it is a task that the university should take up, to be honest, and we would. It's a complex task as well, because you have to look at the demand for hydrogen, and of course you do the economic evaluation. The good news is that there is a project that's ongoing here in Trinidad that is being funded by the IDB, where a hydrogen feasibility study is ongoing. I think National Energy is leading that project, and that report should be available next year. So in the interim, for any substantial study from the universities here, I think that report should help. But my apologies to the chairman that I'm unable to answer what is an excellent question, but would require quite a significant amount of work to answer at this time.
Thank you, and I'll continue with you. You've answered this question online, but I'll repeat it for the benefit of others who may not have seen it, where it was asked in relation to the production of green hydrogen, Are there any initial assessments with regard to the volume of water required for the electrolysis process? What are your considerations on potential water sources for this type of process? So
Yeah.
can you just repeat your answers?
It's an excellent question, and I did state that in my response. So electrolysis is a water-intensive process, and I think in my response, for each kilogram of hydrogen you produce, you might use between 9 and 11 liters of water. And that has to be water of a certain purity. It's distilled water. Depending on the electrolyzer technology, the water would have to be of even a higher purity. So if you use your traditional PEM, PEM electrolyzers, they require high purity water as opposed to alkaline. This is a major issue for us in Trinidad, most definitely, because we need a high quality water to produce hydrogen. And that the base for that high quality water would normally start with drinking water. So if we are to engage in any sort of long-term large hydrogen project, we most definitely have to look at some sort of water desalination project to supply that water for hydrogen. There is a hydrogen project plan for Trinidad, and you could find out more details on what they have planned for water, I believe, from their website. So at least you could get some information there on that project. But water is a major consideration for us, yes. In fact, most of the global hydrogen projects do have desalination plants that accompany them to provide that water.
Thank you. And one of the questions asked online, which you preferred to field live, was you showed a slide on offshore wind for several sites within several hundred megawatts each. What is the estimated marine acreage for those sites? And would there be any environmental and social/maritime challenges, especially with the fishing industry and fisherfolk for offshore wind, or any such non-technical challenges?
Yes, that's another excellent question. I can't remember the acreage at this time, but we most definitely would have ensured that whatever wind farm we would have sited is within the exclusive economic zone of Trinidad and Tobago. With the help of the NGC, we ensured that the siting of the wind turbines will, we are avoiding shipping lanes, most definitely. So we are not, we are trying our best, at least with the siting in this desktop study, to stay away from shipping lanes and popular fishing lanes. In terms of avian migration, or if you're talking about birds, we do have information on what that would be like, and that would be incorporated in our siting model. So we are trying our best to use data that we have and we have available when it comes to the actual siting of the turbines of the Gulf of Paria.
Thank you. Staying with you, I have a question. You have much exposure to e-mobility throughout the Caribbean. What advice can you give to Trinidad and Tobago as the country seeks to increase the penetration of electric vehicles in the transportation mix?
Yeah, my advice is you don't have to look far to get advice. You could look at what's being done in Antigua and Barbuda and Montserrat. And what I like about the initiatives that those countries did is that they looked at e-mobility holistically. So we recently offered a zero tax rating on EVs. Antigua and Montserrat, they zero tax rated the EV charging infrastructure. They zero tax rated the replacement batteries. They zero tax rated the motors. So they looked at not only the EV, the electric vehicle itself, but they looked at the charging infrastructure, and they looked at the parts, or the most popular parts that you may have to change. And I found that an excellent example for the region when it comes to incentives and looking at a holistic incentive for electric vehicles. There is a problem that we still have with regards to that upfront cost. So electric vehicle in Trinidad costs much more than the equivalent ICE or internal combustion vehicle. And we have to look at some sort of special financing to overcome that barrier, especially as it relates to fleets and public transportations. We want to encourage businesses to electrify their fleets. It not only brings about savings for them in terms of operational and fuel costs, but they are responsible for more emissions in the transportation sector. Most of the fleets, as Courtenay Mark highlighted, are diesel. And these are the people you really want to target. So we still have some work to do locally if we want to increase EV adoption. But as I said, you don't have to look far for an example.
Thank you. And getting back to vehicle to grid concept, this question I posed to both you and to Mr. Mark, that given the strides in EV penetration in other countries, the ability for EVs to feed back into the electricity grid has become a reality. What should be considered if that is to be achieved in Trinidad and Tobago? I might first let Courtenay weigh in and then you, Dr. Boodoo. Courtenay?
Sure. Electric vehicles would basically plug into the grid to be charged. So one of the very practical and serious considerations is the grid itself, the electricity grid, must be sufficiently equipped with the capacity to provide the charging of these batteries, because these vehicles, these batteries, they sap up power at a considerable rate. They come like large appliances that you have suddenly put on. So within a residential area, the utility must look at its pole-mounted transformer installations to ensure that there is readiness to provide the charging capability to these vehicles. So the investment, when you look at the country as a whole, would not only be the vehicle, but the utility infrastructure to support home charging of these vehicles. One way to overcome that, though, is to probably better position the public transportation sector, because they do high mileage, the PTSE buses and even maxi taxis in that regard. And their routes are well established so that the points from where they travel can set up the infrastructure for charging. And it will establish a breakthrough in terms of getting the electric vehicle penetration you're looking for. Government has available to itself the opportunity then to waive taxes, duties, and import these vehicles directly and deal with the financing issues associated with it. Also, what tends to happen is, from a very local standpoint, people consult with each other to get advice, fortunately or unfortunately. So we can talk here about electric vehicles, but at the end of the day, a person considering an electric vehicle would go to who? He would go to his mechanic and say, look, I'm considering buying an electric vehicle. You could fix that. That's what he will say. Can you fix that? And the mechanic will say, boy, you see them kind of thing, there's trouble. I don't know about that. You see, I have to speak about what's happening that I know. So strategically, you don't want that to happen. You want to have the public transportation fleet guiding its technicians, equipping them to give the answers that would say these electric vehicles, in fact, are not very difficult. I work at the Public Transportation Corporation, PTSC. We have buses and they work very well. And that's the kind of endorsement you want. So for those reasons, I would point to the public transportation sector, and I would avoid a heavy push at the home charging systems. But it is somewhere we have to go.
Thank you, Mr. Mark. Dr. Boodoo, do you have anything to add?
So on the topic of the vehicle to grid, I would say that being able to use, I actually did talk about this at an event at the Energy Chamber some while back, and I think I called it an emerging technology then. I don't think it's an emerging technology anymore. It is utilized extensively in the UK. They have quite a number of vehicle to grid programs that is ongoing with different utilities. It is most definitely a solution that could be used in the Caribbean and here in Trinidad once we manage it properly. You do get degradation of your own battery pack by feeding back power into the grid, but that degradation is not as much as if you were to charge your EV using a DC fast charger often. I would also like to say that a vehicle to grid program may not be as well suited for private passenger owners, but it's more suited for fleet owners, and particularly as Mr. Mark mentioned, public transportation. The electric bus we have at UTT has a battery capacity of 10 times a Nissan Leaf. A Nissan Leaf might have a 30 kilowatt hour battery pack. We have a 300 kilowatt hour battery pack. So what that means is that rather than use somebody's car for a vehicle to grid program, if you use the bus, it just stores more energy and it can give you more energy. So it's probably a better choice. And then it being part of a fleet, it will be better managed, it will be better monitored, and a fleet owner would have access to special financing in case there may be any degradation or enhanced degradation of the battery pack. But vehicle to grid is important for us for not only cleaning up our grid, whereby we could provide power back into the grid during our peak demand and reduce emissions, but it also adds to resilience, as I had alluded to in a previous point, that if we have a tropical cyclone approaching Trinidad, and we have a large number of persons owning EVs, and if your vehicle is properly charged, and it happens to be vehicle to load enabled, then post-storm, if there isn't any electricity, you could still use your vehicle to provide some sort of emergency electricity. And of course, the buses could provide community installations with electricity because of the size of the battery pack. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Mr. Mark that based on your extensive utility experience, how ready is the local network for the integration of distributed energy resources at the residential and commercial level? And what advice can you give to these stakeholders moving forward? I know you would have discussed what are some of the considerations based on charging vehicles at home, but in terms of the integration of probably solar panels at that scale, what advice would you give to those stakeholders, residential and commercial?
Okay, Cornell, I think people have been knocking at the doors, asking that question about the connection of renewable sources, be it solar panels or any other renewable source. And as Dr. Boodoo had just indicated, one such feed into the grid is also electric vehicles when they in fact come. But you have to have an environment that will enable it. And that is why stakeholders such as the RIC, TNTech, and other players need to come together and establish that. The TNTech Act, the Electricity Act, is referred to as enabling legislation. What enabling legislation means is that under the TNTech Act, TNTech's powers are specifically stated, so that whatever TNTech can do is written in the Act. If something is not written in the TNTech Act, TNTech cannot say that because it is not written, we can now take the position that we are going to proceed in any other direction. So that the Act must allow the connection of renewable energy sources to feed back to the grid. When the Act was written many, many years ago, it would not have been contemplated that the technologies such as renewable energy would have existed. And it treated a generator as what we know as a power station. It treated a generator as a source of electricity that fed into an installation. An installation, on the other hand, was receiving energy. An installation gets energy from the grid and it's unidirectional. In the Act as it is written, it does not contemplate the relationship between generation and installation as bidirectional. So in the legislative agenda, we will have to pay attention to that so that we pull all these pieces together, because it's not very often you are able to change the Act and so on. So I think getting the right people on board, getting our minds together to understand what needs to be put in place to have this, not only a feed-in tariff, because you can have a feed-in tariff, but if the Act doesn't permit it, it just remains there inactive. So that would be the kind of environment, the legislative environment, more than the technical environment, Cornell, that we need to have in place.
Okay, I would like to combine a question from our chair to one that I had also formulated. So my question was, in achieving Trinidad and Tobago's 30% renewable energy mix by 2030, what consideration should be given to the mix of utility scale versus smaller scale distribution energy resources installed at commercial and residential locations? And the chairman wants to further ask, taking into account the cost to implement for residential customers, can the panelists kindly expand on how much of this can be realistically provided for by existing residential customers, taking into account the scenarios for those who are likely to consume for their own consumption versus those likely to make use of it via using a feed-in tariff? So I would like first for Mr. Khan to weigh in on the costing side, and then we will go to Mr. Mark and Dr. Boodoo for technical considerations. Mr. Khan.
What specifically you want me to address?
Okay, so the chairman has asked how much of this can be realistically provided for by our existing residential customers, taking into account those who are likely to consume versus their own consumption versus those likely to use a feed-in tariff policy. So I think basically, what do you think would be the consideration for that residential customer? Would it be one that, okay, I'm just trying to replace my own use, or whether or not I'm trying to utilize whatever incentive the government may offer to participate actively in terms of feeding back to the grid, that sort of thing, which will then weigh into the technical considerations as to whether or not they can be incorporated, how much might actually feed back in the grid to be incorporated.
Yeah, well, what I can say is, and this is using experience outside of Trinidad and Tobago, is that for instance, in Dominica, the largest distributed generation, which might be a business, is somewhere around 250 kilowatts, right? And when you go to the smaller end, you're looking at 5 kilowatts and so on. And for those persons or entities who generate their own electricity, what you find is that on average, and I'm using dollars now, on average, for the month, when they sell the electricity to the grid, they get like about, say, $11,000 or $12,000. That's at the higher end of the 250 kilowatts. So maybe in our context, if you look at it like that, you'll want to figure out, well, which companies might want to install a facility where they, I don't know the size of the power load that they would want. But I mean, if you use those examples, 250, 500 might be the kind of load that you're looking at for a business, right? But then they might not have anything to sell because that might only satisfy their needs. So it will take away some of the production, the generation that is required to service them and reduce the CO2 and so on. But I don't think at this point, and I can't project too far in the future, how significant that would be. Now, in the case of Grenada, all of the installations are relatively small. They're not even up to 100 kilowatts. But they have an arrangement with, but these people have generally done that in order to sell rather than to use, because they're using it as an investment as opposed to home usage. So there, the effect might be better, but it's just that it's not widespread. They're now actively trying to promote it. And several persons, have made inquiries about how they can become involved. So I imagine that that is an ongoing exercise.
Mr. Mark, well, I think that leads into net metering versus net billing. So I don't know if you'll want to weigh in from that perspective in terms of what those present to the resident or the commercial customer.
Okay, well, that is one of the easier questions for the morning. In the presentation, I indicated that the Caribbean average price per kilowatt was in the order of 30 to 35 US cents per kilowatt hour. And I had indicated that Trinidad is in the vicinity of about 6 cents US cents per kilowatt hour. And I think this was endorsed by one of the presentations of proposed electricity rates. So that in one of the Caribbean islands, given the price for solar panels, it may be a no-brainer to install solar panels and simply look at the energy that they will generate times their rate, and they may see they have a 5-10 year or less payback period. And if you did that same calculation in Trinidad, you may get a payback period almost equivalent to the useful life of the solar panels. And at our present electricity rates, you may then say, well, maybe it might be better for me to invest in a piece of land and just maybe leave it there and let it appreciate. So that this question of net billing, just to explain to our viewing audience, net billing is where metering infrastructure trades off at the existing utility, looks at the utility rate, and net metering would basically net off at the meter. So the rate that the utility is charging you, you put it back on the grid through the meter nets it off, and that's your saving. So that would not, in the Trinidad context, while it's the preferred arrangement, in our present context, it wouldn't attract people. So then the other option would be net billing, where the meter is able to separately account for the electricity that you have put back onto the grid and incentivize people who have made that investment to benefit from a tariff that is called a feed-in tariff to so cause them to invest. So that will be the subtle difference between net billing and net metering.
Okay, thank you. We've had other questions answered online in our question and answer segment, but there are some that we have still outstanding to be answered. So those I will start to pose. First, with reference to Mr. Mark again, one of the participants is asking, what are some of the measures that have been taken by the utility, TNTech, to reduce the transmission and distribution losses?
Okay, so in my presentation earlier on, we spoke on the generation side. We spoke about heat recovery steam generation using combined cycle. But on the transmission and distribution side, I can think of three examples that would have been used by the utility. Firstly, let us remember that in Trinidad, we now have no generating facilities north of Point Lisas. All the generating capacity in the country either resides in the Point Lisas industrial estate or south of Point Lisas, meaning that the northern half of Trinidad is supplied with some 600 megawatts of that order coming from the central and southern half of the country. As you move power, the currents associated with the movement of power generate losses. So what you want to do is reduce the amount of current passing through the system while delivering the same power. So to achieve this, TNTech would have elevated its previously highest transmission voltage of 132,000 volts to a voltage of 220,000 volts to move large amounts of power from the TGU power plant in Labre into the Point Lisas area. A second initiative was what you call reactive power compensation, where the utility, I was there at the time, would have installed grid-scale capacitors in the Mount Hope and Barataria areas of their substations, reducing the amount of power transmitted over the lines for reactive power. Thirdly, power would have reached to Tobago through the grid and via submarine cable into the Cove Power Station. That power station had a capacity before the addition of a recently added generator, GE gas turbine, that caused the power to move from Trinidad through the network into Tobago. That inefficient transportation of power and the attendant losses have now disappeared by the investment made by the government of Trinidad and Tobago in having Tobago Cove Power Station equipped with modern gas turbine plant, which not only makes Tobago quite resilient, but do you believe that in the event of a natural disaster, if North Trinidad were to be cut off because of transmission interference, Tobago actually has the capacity to supply Trinidad with power reaching as far as around the Sandy Grande area. So I think TNTech at the grid level has taken these initiatives to reduce losses. There are others where there are pole-mounted capacitors on the distribution system, but at the grid level, those three stand out in my mind.
Thank you. In rounding off this session, I'll just like to ask Mr. Khan, on behalf of the RIC, some questions that have been raised by our viewers with reference to pricing. So one question posed was there was reference to the true cost of electricity in one of the RIC's presentations. Is the present cost of electricity truly subsidized? Can you shed more light on what the true cost of electricity alludes to? Thank you.
Right. Well, I would respond by saying that in any production system, you have fixed costs and you have variable costs. The fixed costs don't tend to change very much, even though that there is some O&M related to a fixed cost. But the variable costs, they change on the basis of what inputs you have in your production process. So in the case of electricity, you have many things that you have to buy and use consistently to produce electricity. And since the last price increase for electricity was in 2010, you would imagine that the cost of electricity in 2021 to produce it, in fact, or to distribute and supply it, would not be the same as it was in 2010. And essentially then, you could argue that what people are paying now is not the true cost because there has been no rate review. And well, I think it's a well-known fact that the government of Trinidad and Tobago subsidizes electricity through the gas price. So the price of electricity is subsidized, yes, we know that. But since the last review was in 2010, you can safely say that no one is actually paying the costs that would be 2021 costs if you had to look at it that way. I think that should suffice.
Thank you. And the last question I want to pose relates to billing. One viewer had asked when can they expect monthly billing to commence? And another viewer asked poses the question that there's a proposal to change from a bi-monthly to monthly residential billing was made to ease consumers' financial burden and align with monthly other expenses. However, it should also be considered that the current bi-monthly billing system is quite useful to consumers since this system already eases financial burdens when compared with the challenge of other recurring monthly expenses.
Right, well, it is a proposal, the monthly billing that the RIC has at the moment. And any proposal that the RIC has is first discussed generally with all stakeholders to get their views on this. So it's not a fait accompli as such, but it's a matter to be consulted upon with the members of the public.
Thank you. So viewers, I wish to remind you that questions that were not answered and even the answers to these questions, we will try to put together responses so that we can share by our various online social media. And at this time, I would like to end this part of the program, and I thank you viewers for your attention and participation. I now hand over to Giselle.
Thank you very much, Cornell. Let me start by first expressing my sincere gratitude on behalf of the Regulated Industries Commission to the Honorable Marvin Gonzalez, Minister of Public Utilities, for taking time to share his thoughts and the government of Trinidad and Tobago's position and commitment to addressing the current climate crisis. Today, we also heard from our distinguished presenters and panelists about the challenges of ensuring sustainability in energy sustainability in the light of climate change, the opportunities available, and the action necessary to combat these issues in the present. I would sincerely like to thank all our presenters and panelists, Mr. Jean-Michel Paul, Dr. Curtis Boodoo, Mr. Courtenay Mark, for their thought-provoking and well-developed presentations, and of course the lively discussions in the panel discussion this morning. I would also like to thank Mrs. Dawn Callender, our RIC Chairman, Mr. Glenn Khan, RIC Executive Director, our RIC presenters, and of course our moderator today, Mr. Cornell Motley, for their significant contributions to today's event. To all of you, our attendees on Facebook and on Zoom, I say a special thank you to all of you for joining us, for your insightful questions, and for your participation in the RIC's first webinar. You can also be on the lookout for our second installment of the RIC Webinar Series, where we propose to explore the topic of water security and water conservation in Trinidad and Tobago and the region. Combating the negative effects of climate change is our collective responsibility, not solely the responsibility of policymakers and industry experts. We know that meeting the challenge of the climate crisis takes creativity, community, as well as policy and advocacy. Each of us can do our part in effecting change by making our voices heard, by continuing to lobby and collaborate with the policymakers, but also we can individually make smarter, more energy efficient choices in our homes by investing in energy efficient appliances or renewable sources of power, or even simply by the choice of vehicle that we drive. I know our presenters today gave us a lot of food for thought on a regional, local, and even on a personal level, and together we can make it happen. I would just also like to say, for those who are viewing now and those who would have registered for our webinar, we will have the video recording of our webinar available to you in a short space of time, hopefully within the next week. As we close today, I would now like to leave you with a short animated video on the RIC's quality of service standards for the electricity transmission and distribution sector. So please enjoy, and thank you so much, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
We have all experienced unplanned power outages. Did you know that after 10 hours, that becomes a breach of Guaranteed Electricity Standard number 1, and that you're entitled to a credit on your account? There are 8 guaranteed electricity standards that set the service level you can expect from your provider. They form part of the quality of service standards established by the Regulated Industries Commission. Maybe you have lights, but since you got connected, you haven't received your first bill. Residential bills should arrive within 60 days after service connection, or 30 days if you're a non-residential customer. Is it that your service was not restored even though you paid for reconnection, or paid off arrears, or agreed on a payment schedule, and you still haven't been reconnected, and that was over 24 hours ago or 1 business day? Or perhaps you made an appointment with your electricity provider and no one showed up. Don't be in the dark about your rights as an electricity consumer. These are just 4 of the 8 guaranteed electricity standards. Stay tuned for our next video about the other 4 GES. To find out more about our quality of service standards, visit the Regulated Industries Commission website or social media pages, or call us at 800-4RIC.